Something disappears every night. Not your body, not your breathing, not even your dreams. Something quieter leaves first, so quietly that no one ever notices it go. The thing you call yourself. If that sounds unsettling, stay with it for a moment, because this disappearance doesn't feel like danger. It feels like relief. Every night, without ceremony, without permission, without memory, you let go of the self you spent all day protecting. The name, the worries, the unfinished thoughts looping in your head, the constant sense of me standing in the center of everything, and somehow, you survive. Tonight's question is not meant to frighten you. It's meant to slow you down. What if sleep is not rest for the body, but a temporary death of the self? Not a violent death, not an ending. Just a quiet withdrawal, a soft disappearance, a moment where the weight of being someone is finally put down. Before we go any further, let me ask you to do something simple. If you're the kind of person who finds comfort in these late-night questions, if you're the kind who listens not to be taught, but to stay with the feeling a little longer, then like this recording, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings. Not for the algorithm, not for numbers, but so these quiet questions don't disappear when the night does. Now, stay with me. Think about the last time you fell asleep. Not the dream, not the alarm that woke you, but the exact moment before everything went dark. Your body was still there. Your bed was still there. The room didn't vanish, but you did. No name. No story, no responsibilities waiting in line, just absence. And the strange part is this, that absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. All day long, the self works nonstop. It narrates, it compares, it worries, it remembers what hurt and anticipates what might hurt again. It holds together your identity like a tight knot. I am this kind of person. I should have done that. I need to be better tomorrow. The self is not evil. It's functional. It keeps you alive in a social world. It helps you survive, belong, defend, explain. But it is heavy, and every night something remarkable happens. That weight is removed. You don't decide to let go of yourself. It lets go of you. No effort, no philosophy, no training. Sleep doesn't negotiate with the ego. It simply outlasts it. Notice how little resistance you put up. You might fight sleep for a while, scrolling, thinking, replaying conversations. But eventually, the self runs out of fuel. Thoughts stretch out. They lose their edges. Sentences stop finishing themselves. And then, nothing. No center. No observer standing apart from the experience. Just darkness without fear. If the self were essential to your existence, this would be terrifying. If you were truly the core of consciousness, sleep would feel like annihilation. But it doesn't. In fact, the deeper the sleep, the safer it feels. Which raises a gentle but unsettling question. If you can disappear every night without harm, what exactly is the self during the day? We tend to imagine the self as something solid, a fixed point inside the mind. A commander giving orders, but sleep tells a different story. The body continues perfectly well without the self. Breathing adjusts. The heart maintains its rhythm. The brain organizes memories, repairs tissue, recalibrates chemistry. All of this happens while you're gone. No supervision required. So maybe the self is not the engine. Maybe it's the interface, a temporary construct, a daytime tool, something the mind assembles each morning and dismantles at night, not because it's fragile, but because it's unnecessary after dark. think about how silence works. Silence isn't something you create. It's what remains when noise stops. Sleep may work the same way. The self is not killed. It is simply no longer being generated. The narration shuts down. The sense of me fades out. And what remains doesn't feel empty. It feels wide. Have you ever noticed how anxiety cannot follow you into deep sleep? Not because your problems are solved, but because the one who worries is no longer present. Worry needs a self. Regret needs a self. Shame needs a self. Remove the self, and these emotions lose their anchor. This is why sleep feels merciful. It's the only time you are completely free from having to be someone. No performance, no identity maintenance, no internal courtroom replaying evidence, just rest. And yet, we rarely think of sleep this way. We talk about it as recovery, as recharging, as downtime. But what if it's something more radical? What if sleep is the one place where the self is allowed to dissolve without consequences? A rehearsal for letting go. A nightly reminder that existence does not require constant self-reference, that the universe doesn't collapse when your story pauses. This doesn't mean the self is fake. It means it's conditional. It exists when needed and vanishes when it's not, like a light that turns on only when the room is in use. As you listen to this, you may feel a subtle shift, not understanding, just recognition, because you've been here before, every night. You just don't remember it. There is something profoundly calming about realizing that you don't have to carry yourself forever, that even without effort, without intention, you are allowed to rest from being you. And this raises another question, quieter than the first. If the self can disappear so completely in sleep, what is it made of when it returns? Because every morning, somehow, the self comes back, reassembled, reactivated, loaded with memory, identity, and concern. But is it the same self, or just a familiar pattern restarting? That question doesn't need an answer yet. For now, just notice this. Tonight, when you sleep, nothing essential will be lost. You will disappear, and the world will remain gentle. And somewhere between the last thought you finish and the first dream you never remember, the self will quietly step aside, leaving behind something softer, deeper, and far less burdened to carry you into the night. The self feels obvious while you're awake, so obvious that questioning it almost feels unnecessary. You wake up and the sense of me is already there, waiting. It knows your name before you remember it. It remembers what yesterday left unfinished. It steps into the day as if it never left. And because it arrives so reliably, we mistake it for something solid, something permanent, something that must exist in order for experience to exist at all. But notice how rarely you actually see the self. You feel hunger. You hear sound. You notice light shifting across the room. Yet the self itself is never one of these things. It doesn't have a texture. It doesn't have a color. It doesn't appear in front of you the way objects do. And still, everything seems to revolve around it. When you say, I am tired, what exactly is that I? When you say, I don't want this, where is the thing that wants or refuses? When you say, this happened to me, where does me begin? And where does the event end? The self feels like a center point, but it's a strange kind of center. Not a place you can locate, not a thing you can isolate, more like a reference, a perspective that says, this is happening to someone. Most of the time, that perspective is so tightly fused to experience that it feels inseparable. Thoughts arise, and immediately they belong to someone. Emotions move through the body, and instantly they are labeled mine. Memories surface, and they arrange themselves into a story with a main character, you. But stories require structure. They require continuity. They require something to hold one moment to the next. And that may be the first clue. The self is not a thing. It is a process that binds sensations, memories, expectations, and emotions into a single thread and calls it identity. You can feel this most clearly when the process falters. Have you ever been so absorbed in something that the sense of yourself faded? Not asleep, not dreaming, just gone. You might have been watching rain fall or listening to music in the dark. You might have been driving a familiar road late at night. For a few seconds or minutes, there was experience without commentary. No one thinking, I am experiencing this. Just the experience itself. And then, suddenly, the self snapped back into place. Oh, I was somewhere else just now. That return is revealing. If the self were the core of consciousness, it couldn't leave and come back like that. It couldn't flicker. It couldn't thin out and then reassemble. Yet it does, all the time. During the day, the self is constantly being rebuilt. Every memory you recall strengthens it. Every plan you make reinforces it. Every comparison, better, worse, behind, ahead, adds another layer. The self feeds on time. It needs a past to explain itself and a future to protect. This is why the present moment feels so different. The closer experience gets to now, the harder it is for the self to hold on. There is no story in the present, no trajectory, no evaluation, just sensation unfolding, which may be why the self works so hard to escape it. The mind jumps forward, the mind jumps back. The self stays busy narrating, justifying, rehearsing, because a quiet moment with no narrative threatens its existence. And then night comes. Sleep doesn't argue with the self. It doesn't confront it. It doesn't dismantle it piece by piece. It simply removes the conditions the self needs to operate. Memory loosens its grip, attention narrows, then dissolves. Time loses its structure. Without time, the self cannot orient itself. Without memory, it cannot recognize itself. Without attention, it cannot stay assembled. So it fades, not because it is weak, but because it is situational. Think about how language works. You don't carry sentences around all day waiting to speak them. They form only when needed. The self may be similar. A useful construction, a temporary coherence, something the brain generates when interaction with the world demands it. During the day, that demand is constant. Social roles, decisions, threats, expectations. The self is required. At night, none of that applies. There is no one to impress while you sleep, no future to plan, no past to defend. So the self steps aside. This explains something subtle but important. Why sleep feels safe. If the self were your true core, its disappearance would feel like danger, like falling, like being erased. But deep sleep feels like the opposite of erasure. It feels like being held, which suggests that what remains when the self dissolves is not nothing. It is something more fundamental. Breathing continues without effort. The heart maintains its rhythm. The brain performs intricate work, sorting memories, balancing chemistry, repairing itself, all without an identity attached. No one is supervising these processes. No I is making decisions, and yet everything functions. This raises a quiet possibility. What if the self is not the owner of experience, but a guest? A guest that arrives in the morning, rearranges the furniture, tells stories about the house, and then leaves at night. The house remains. You might feel resistance to this idea. That resistance itself belongs to the self. It wants to be central. It wants to be necessary. It wants to believe that without it, nothing meaningful exists. But sleep tells a different story, meaning maybe something the self adds, not something it creates. The world doesn't disappear when you sleep. Your body doesn't vanish. Experience continues in some form, even if you don't remember it. The self's absence doesn't collapse reality, it simplifies it. And this simplification may be why sleep is restorative. Not because you escape the world, but because you escape the constant task of being someone in it. Think about exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, but the tiredness that comes from thinking too much about yourself, replaying conversations, second-guessing choices, worrying about how you are perceived. That fatigue belongs to the self, and every night that fatigue is allowed to end, not through resolution, but through disappearance. Sleep does not fix your problems. It removes the problem holder for a while. This might explain why worries often feel less intense in the morning, even if nothing has changed. The self that wakes up is not quite the same one that went to sleep. It has been rebuilt from memory, but something has shifted. Edges are softer. Urgency is reduced. It's as if the self has been rinsed, which suggests that the self is not a singular entity carried intact through time. It is reconstructed again and again, each day a new version, familiar but not identical. And if that's true, then the self is closer to a pattern than a thing, a configuration that arises under certain conditions. Conditions like wakefulness, memory, and attention. Remove those conditions, and the pattern dissolves. This is not a flaw. It is a feature, a flexible system that allows you to engage deeply with the world when needed, and then completely let go. As you listen now, the self is present. You are aware that you are listening. You might be thinking about what this means for you, but notice how gently that awareness can soften, how easily the sense of me listening can blur into just sound arriving. That blurring is the doorway sleep uses. It doesn't push you through. It waits for you to drift close enough, and somewhere ahead, there is a moment when the self no longer recognizes itself as necessary, when the narrative pauses, when the center dissolves, and in that dissolution there is no panic, only rest, which leads to another question, one that feels even closer to home. If the self is a process that fades when conditions change, what happens in the moments just before it disappears completely? What does it feel like when the self begins to lose its grip, before sleep takes it all the way? There is a moment most people live through every night, and almost no one remembers. It isn't the moment you fall asleep. Not exactly. It's the moment before that, when your mind still insists on being someone, but it starts failing at the job. That's the fragile borderland, the place where the self begins to crack. And if you've ever struggled with sleep, you already know what it feels like, even if you can't describe it clearly, because it doesn't feel like a clean switch. It feels like the self slipping. During the day, your thoughts tend to behave as if they belong to a single owner. They line up like a conversation. They follow a thread, even if the thread is messy. But at night, that ownership weakens. A thought appears, then dissolves before it finishes. A sentence forms, then loses the last few words. You start to remember something from years ago, not because you chose it, but because it drifted up like a bubble. You try to hold it, and it pops. And that effort, that subtle effort to hold the bubble, is the self trying to stay assembled. Because the self loves continuity. The self needs the next thought to connect to the previous one. It needs a story, even a small story, to prove it exists. So it keeps trying. It reviews your day. It rehearses tomorrow. It edits conversations you can't change. It invents conversations that will never happen. Not because it enjoys suffering, but because it's doing what it was built to do. Maintain a stable identity in a world that constantly threatens it. But then the body starts changing the conditions. Breathing slows, muscles release, temperature shifts. Your eyes stop searching the dark. And the mind, quietly, without asking, begins to loosen its grip on the I that was clenching all day. This is where the strange part begins, because the self doesn't just fade, it flickers. You can feel it in little lapses. You're thinking about something important, and suddenly you don't care. Not because you solved it, because for a second the one who cared is not fully there. You're holding a worry, and it slides out of your hands. You try to pull it back, almost out of habit, and that action feels exhausting. It's not the worry that's heavy. It's the act of being the kind of person who worries. This is why bedtime can feel like a negotiation with yourself. Part of you wants to keep control. Part of you wants to stop being in charge. And the more exhausted you are, the clearer the conflict becomes. You may have noticed something else, too. In that borderland, your sense of time starts to deform. 5 minutes can feel like an hour. An hour can collapse into nothing. You might check the clock and feel betrayed by it. How is it already that late? Or, how has it only been that long? That distortion matters because the self feeds on time. The self is, in many ways, a time-based creature. It is built out of before and after, out of memory and prediction, out of cause and consequence. When time loses structure, the self loses footing, and then the mind begins to do something it doesn't do as often during the day. It starts to float. Images arise without context. A face, a hallway, a place you haven't thought about in years. Not a full dream yet, just fragments. And these fragments are important because they don't ask permission. During the day, you usually choose what to focus on, even if that choice is automatic. At night, the mind starts pulling random items from storage and holding them up to the dark, as if testing whether you are still there to label them. Sometimes you catch yourself in the middle of one of these fragments and feel confused. Why was I thinking about that? Where did that come from? That confusion is the self noticing that it is no longer fully in charge, because before sleep, the mind becomes less centralized. The clear leadership of the self begins to dissolve into a more distributed kind of awareness, like a city during a power outage, where small pockets of light remain, but the main grid is down, and the self hates that. Not in a dramatic way, in a practical way, because the self is designed to prevent exactly this, uncontrolled drift. To the self, drift feels like danger, even if your body is safe, even if your room is quiet, even if nothing is actually wrong. The self interprets loss of control as a threat to identity, That's why some people, right at the edge of sleep, experience a sudden jolt, a hypnic jerk, a feeling of falling, a flash of panic. It's as if the system that maintains the self senses itself slipping and pulls hard on the cord one last time. Wake up, reassemble, return. But if you don't fight it, something else happens. The mind discovers that letting go does not lead to harm. The drift becomes softer. The fragments become longer. Not yet dreams, but closer. The I becomes less prominent, and this is where the borderland becomes almost beautiful. Because you can feel the self thinning out. Your thoughts slow down, not because you are forcing them to, but because the machinery of narration is losing power. Your body becomes heavier, not because gravity increases, but because the self is no longer holding the body in a state of readiness. Readiness is a daytime posture. Sleep is a surrender. And surrender doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like being allowed. This might be why people who are overwhelmed sometimes crave sleep the way thirsty people crave water. They don't just want rest. They want an escape from themselves, not an escape in a shameful way, not a dramatic disappearance, just relief from the constant inner presence that says, me, 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 because the self, as useful as it is, can become too loud. It becomes a commentator who never stops speaking, a manager who never stops assigning tasks, a critic who never stops evaluating. And in the borderland before sleep, the critic's voice begins to lose clarity, not because you silenced it, because the stage is emptying. Here's a question you can test tonight. When you're lying in bed and you notice your mind drifting, don't ask, "Why can't I sleep?" Instead, ask something quieter. Who is it that can't let go? Because the inability to sleep is often the self insisting on staying intact. It wants to finish one more thought, solve one more problem, rehearse one more future. And even when you tell yourself, stop thinking, the one telling yourself is still the self, still working. The borderland is not a battle to be won, it's a fade out, a dimming, a slow release of a tight grip. And it's in that release that the strangest thing happens. You begin to lose the sensation that you are the center. At first it's subtle. You might still hear the fan, still feel the blanket, still notice the weight of your own body. But the sense of, I am hearing, I am feeling, I am noticing begins to soften. Experience remains, but ownership weakens. And that may be the true entrance to sleep, not unconsciousness, but de-ownership. Not the end of experience, but the end of a narrator standing over it. If sleep is a temporary death of the self, then this borderland is the moment the self begins to understand it is allowed to leave. Not forced, not erased, allowed. But then something else enters, because as the self fades, another kind of world begins to form. A world where logic loosens, where identity bends, where you can be someone else without effort. The earliest shape of that world is not a dream yet. It's a strange pre-dream, a quiet hallucination of fragments and feelings. And once that doorway opens, it becomes harder and harder for the self to return to its usual posture. So the next question is unavoidable. If the self is already cracking in the minutes before sleep, what happens when it finally breaks apart completely? And the first true dream begins. There is a moment in sleep when something very specific disappears. Not thought, not awareness, not even experience. What disappears is your name, not metaphorically, literally. In deep sleep, there is no label attached to what is happening, no tag that says, "This is me," no identifier that says this belongs to someone called you. Your name is one of the strongest anchors of the self. It gathers memory around it. It organizes history. It pulls identity into a single point. When someone calls your name while you are awake, attention snaps instantly into place. The self reassembles in a fraction of a second, but when you sleep deeply, that signal has nowhere to land. The name falls into silence, and with it, something else quietly dissolves. Your personal story, the story of where you came from, what you've been through, what kind of person you believe yourself to be. All of that requires a narrative thread. Sleep cuts the thread. This is difficult to notice because memory does not survive the cut. You can't remember what it's like to have no name. You can only infer it from the absence you wake up from. But the evidence is there. If you truly remained yourself all night, waking up would feel continuous, like stepping out of a room and back in again. Instead, waking feels like rebooting. There is a brief moment, sometimes just a breath, where you're conscious but not yet assembled. No urgency, no identity, just sensation returning. Light behind the eyelids, weight in the limbs, sound without interpretation. Then memory rushes in. Your name reattaches. Your life snaps back into focus. The self locks into place. That gap matters because it suggests that the self is not stored somewhere intact overnight. It is reconstructed. Every morning, you are not resuming a paused identity. You are rebuilding one. This rebuilding process is so fast and familiar that it feels invisible. But speed does not equal permanence. Think about how quickly a reflection appears when you look into a mirror. The image is immediate, but it isn't stored in the glass. It exists only while conditions are right. The self may work the same way. When the brain has access to memory, language, and a sense of time, the reflection appears. When those conditions dissolve, the image vanishes. Sleep is not the mirror breaking. It's the lights going out. And in the dark, there is no reflection to cling to. This raises an unsettling but gentle possibility. What if the self is not something you have, but something that happens? An event, a pattern, a process that activates when the world requires interaction and deactivates when it doesn't. During the day, the world is loud with signals. People expect responses. Decisions demand ownership. Actions need attribution. Who did this? Who said that? Who is responsible? The self answers those questions. At night, the questions stop. There is no audience, no expectation, no consequence. So the self is relieved of duty. This might explain why deep sleep is so difficult to interrupt. You can shake someone lightly and they might not respond. You can call their name and nothing happens, because the system that recognizes the name is offline, not damaged, not destroyed, just unavailable. And in that unavailability, something remarkable occurs. Experience continues without reference. There is sensation without a center, processing without a processor, activity without identity. We struggle to imagine this because imagination itself belongs to the waking self. It always places someone inside the scene. But sleep does not require imagination. It does not require understanding. It does not require a witness. The body knows how to exist without commentary. The brain knows how to function without autobiography. This is why deep sleep feels so distant when you try to recall it. There is nothing to recall from, no narrator, no observer standing apart to later report what happened. only the absence of a report. And yet, that absence is deeply restorative, which suggests that the constant presence of the self may not be natural in the way we assume. It may be adaptive, but costly. Every thought routed through me, every feeling evaluated as mine, every moment measured against a personal timeline, that processing load never shuts off during the day until night removes the reference point entirely. You don't get relief because you solved your life. You get relief because life stops being about you, and this relief is so complete that even fear dissolves. Fear needs a future. Fear needs a self that could be harmed. In deep sleep, there is no projected future and no protected identity. So fear has nothing to attach to. This is why even people burdened by anxiety often experience deep, dreamless sleep as peaceful. Not because their nervous system forgot how to fear, but because the framework fear depends on is absent. The self is a framework. It organizes experience around survival, continuity, and meaning. Sleep suspends that organization, and what remains is simpler, not emptier, just quieter. This might be why we describe good sleep as going under, as if something is submerged, as if the surface identity sinks, leaving a deeper layer untouched by waves. That deeper layer doesn't have a name. It doesn't need one. It doesn't worry about coherence or consistency. It simply is. And when morning comes, the surface rises again. The self reforms. The name returns. The story resumes. But something has changed, because for several hours, the self did not exist, and nothing went wrong. The world continued. The body healed. The brain worked, which leaves us with a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer we sit with it. If the self can vanish so completely and reality remains stable without it, what exactly is the self protecting us from during the day? And why does it feel so urgent to return every morning, as if something essential would be lost if it stayed gone just a little longer? There is a reason worry cannot follow you into deep sleep, not because your problems disappear, not because the world suddenly becomes safer, not because tomorrow stops existing. Worry disappears because the one who worries does. Anxiety is not just a feeling, it is a relationship between a self and an imagined future. During the day, this relationship feels unavoidable. Thoughts jump ahead. Consequences line up. The self positions itself at the center of every possible outcome. What if this goes wrong? What if I fail? What if they think less of me? Each question assumes something fundamental, that there is a stable me who must be protected across time. Worry feeds on that assumption. It needs a continuous self, a character who can be hurt later, judged later, regret later. Take away that character, and worry has no stage. This is why anxiety feels so real when you're awake, and so impossible to hold when you're asleep. You might fall asleep thinking about a problem that feels enormous, unbearable, urgent. But once deep sleep arrives, that urgency evaporates completely. Not reduced, not postponed, gone. And when you wake up, the problem returns, but slightly altered, softer around the edges, less sharp. Not because you solved it in your sleep, but because the self that worried about it was interrupted. Anxiety depends on continuity. It requires the same self to carry the same fear forward. Sleep breaks that chain. This is not metaphorical, it is structural. To worry, the mind must hold multiple representations at once: a present self, a future self, and a predicted threat connecting them. This is cognitively expensive. It demands attention, memory, and identity. Deep sleep removes all three. There is no future self in deep sleep. There is no projected outcome. There is no me later to defend. So anxiety collapses, not because it's defeated, but because it is unsupported. This may be why worry often intensifies at night before sleep. The self senses what's coming. It senses its own weakening, and like any system facing shutdown, it tries to do more, not less. It replays, it plans, it panics, as if urgency could keep it alive. But once the conditions shift far enough, the effort fails, and the relief that follows is not emotional. It is existential. You are not calm because you feel better. You are calm because there is no one left to feel bad. This sounds unsettling when stated directly, but you already know it intuitively. Think about the phrase people use after a good night's sleep. I feel like myself again. That phrase hides something strange. If you had to return to yourself, where were you? And if you could leave yourself without harm, why does being yourself feel so necessary during the day? The answer may lie in function, not truth. The self is not here to make you peaceful. It is here to make you effective. It helps you anticipate danger, navigate social complexity, preserve continuity. Anxiety is not a malfunction of the self. It is one of its byproducts, a side effect of constantly scanning for threats to identity and future stability. Sleep suspends that scan, not because threats are gone, but because identity is offline. This is why sleep deprivation is so psychologically damaging. When the self cannot fully disengage, worry compounds, thoughts loop, fears escalate, perspective collapses. It's not just that you're tired, it's that the self never gets to die, even temporarily. And without that temporary death, there is no reset, no interruption of the narrative, no relief from the responsibility of being someone. In this light, sleep is not passive rest. It is an active release, a system-level shutdown of identity maintenance, and the relief it brings is proportional to how tightly the self has been holding on. This might explain why people under extreme stress often sleep deeply when they finally can. The self is exhausted, not physically, structurally. It has been carrying too many timelines, too many outcomes, too many versions of itself. Sleep is the only place where it is allowed to stop. And notice something else. In deep sleep, you're not aware of your lack of worry. You do not think, I am finally at peace, because that thought would require a self. Peace in sleep is not an experience. It is the absence of a problem holder. This distinction matters because it suggests that peace is not something to be achieved, but something that appears when identity relaxes. During the day, we often try to solve anxiety by changing thoughts, by reframing, by analyzing, by understanding. All of these approaches operate within the self. They rearrange the furniture. They do not leave the house. Sleep leaves the house entirely, which raises a difficult question. If relief comes not from fixing the self's problems, but from suspending the self itself, what does that say about the role the self plays in our suffering? This is not an argument against having a self. It is an argument against mistaking it for what you are. The self is a tool for navigating complexity. It is not a sanctuary, and expecting it to provide peace may be asking it to do something it was never designed to do. Peace appears when the self rests. This doesn't mean we should seek to eliminate identity while awake. The world requires participation, but it does suggest something subtle, that the self is not the final layer of experience, that beneath it there is something more stable, something that does not worry because it does not project itself into time. Sleep gives you access to that layer every night, not as knowledge, not as insight, as absence. And absence, in this case, is restorative. You may notice this when you wake from deep sleep without dreaming. There is a brief clarity, a neutrality. For a moment, before the mind remembers who you are supposed to be, there is no problem, no agenda, just presence. That moment is fragile. It collapses quickly under memory and obligation. But its existence is proof. Proof that anxiety is not fundamental, proof that the self is not required for being, and proof that letting go, even completely, is not only safe but necessary. Which brings us closer to something even stranger. If worry vanishes because the self vanishes, and fear dissolves because the future dissolves, what happens to morality, responsibility, judgment? What happens to right and wrong when there is no one to claim ownership? Because in sleep, not only do worries disappear, so do the rules that govern the waking self. And that leads us into the next quiet territory, the place where ethics soften, where guilt loses its grip, and where the human mind, freed from identity, operates by an entirely different logic, one that only reveals itself when the self is no longer there to interfere. If the self dissolves in sleep, then something else must remain, because experience does not end. Breathing continues, the heart keeps its quiet rhythm, the brain does not power down, it shifts. There is activity without a narrator. This is where many people instinctively say, that must be consciousness, as if consciousness were the thing that stays behind when the self leaves. But that assumption hides something important, because consciousness, as we usually imagine it, still belongs to the waking world. It still implies awareness of something, a watcher, a light shining on an object, and in deep sleep, that structure seems to vanish as well. There is no clear watcher, no object being watched, no boundary between the two. So what remains? Perhaps consciousness is not what we think it is. Perhaps it is not a room you are inside, not a container holding experience. Perhaps it is more like a light. When the light is on, the room appears. Objects emerge. Distances make sense. When the light goes off, the room does not disappear. It simply stops being visible. The self may be one of the things that only exists when the light is on. During the day, awareness is directed outward and inward at the same time. You are aware of the world, and you are aware that you are aware of the world. That second layer, the awareness of being aware, is deeply tied to the self. It creates a sense of position, a center, a point from which experience seems to radiate. But at night, that second layer dims. Awareness does not vanish all at once. It thins, like a spotlight slowly narrowing, then fading, until only darkness remains, not as an object, but as a condition. This is why deep sleep is so difficult to describe. Language itself depends on structure, subject and object, cause and effect. Sleep dissolves those distinctions. So when you wake up and try to explain where you were, you have nothing to point to, no experience to narrate, no images to report, no feelings to translate, only the certainty that something essential occurred, something restorative. This certainty is strange because it exists without memory. You don't remember deep sleep, you infer it. You wake up changed, which suggests that whatever remains when the self and the narrator dissolve is not concerned with being remembered. It is not trying to communicate. It is not trying to mean anything. It simply operates. Consider how much effort the waking mind puts into maintaining coherence. Thoughts must make sense. Emotions must be justified. Actions must align with identity. All of this coherence collapses in sleep, and yet nothing breaks. In fact, things improve. The body heals. The mind reorganizes. Memory is sorted and integrated, all without supervision, which raises a subtle but unsettling possibility. What if coherence is not required for functioning? What if the self's constant effort to make sense of everything is not the foundation of order, but a surface-level overlay? What if beneath the narrative mind there is a deeper system that does not think in stories at all? Sleep may be your only direct contact with that system, not as an observer, but as an absence. Think about how often we equate consciousness with control. Being conscious means deciding, choosing, directing attention. But sleep reveals another mode of existence, one without control, yet without chaos. Processes unfold according to internal rhythms. Patterns shift and resolve. It is not random. It is simply not personal. No one is in charge. And yet, everything works. This challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions of the waking self, that without me, things would fall apart. Sleep quietly disproves that assumption every night. The world inside you does not need a manager. It needs conditions. When the self steps aside, those conditions can finally take over. This might be why people describe good sleep as feeling deep rather than long. Depth implies layers. The deeper you go, the less personal things become. Surface thoughts dissolve first, then personal memories, then even the sense of being an observer. What remains is not blankness, but something more neutral, a baseline, not happiness, not sadness, just functioning without friction. And when awareness returns in the morning, it returns through layers. First sensation, then orientation, then memory, then identity. The self is last to arrive, which suggests that it is not the foundation of experience, but the final assembly. This order matters because it means that consciousness, whatever that word ultimately points to, does not depend on identity. Identity depends on consciousness, not the other way around. The self is not the source of awareness. It is a modulation of it, a specific tuning for a specific purpose, useful during the day, unnecessary at night. You may notice this tuning change even before sleep fully arrives. Moments when attention becomes diffuse, when sounds blend together, when the boundary between inside and outside softens. These are not failures of awareness, they are transitions. The mind shifting from a focused beam to a wide field, from sharp edges to gradients. The self prefers sharp edges, clear distinctions, defined roles. The deeper layers of experience do not. They operate in continuums. This is why sleep feels immersive rather than directional. There is nowhere to go, nothing to aim at, just a gradual sinking. And in that sinking, something else becomes possible. The brain is no longer occupied with maintaining a consistent me. Resources are freed. Patterns that were impossible to reconcile during the day can now coexist. Contradictions are allowed. Memories that conflict can be stored without resolution. Sleep is not about clarity. It is about integration, and integration does not require a narrator. It requires openness. The self is excellent at explanation, but explanation is not the same as understanding. Sleep understands without explaining. It doesn't justify, it doesn't interpret, it reorganizes, which might explain why insight sometimes arrives after sleep, even though no conscious thinking occurred. The work was done elsewhere, in a layer of mind that does not speak, a layer that does not care whether you understand what it's doing. It only cares that things are balanced. This balance is not moral, not logical. It is physiological, neurological, rhythmic. And when the self returns in the morning, it often takes credit. I feel better. I figured it out. I'm ready. But the self did not do the work. It was absent. This realization can be unsettling because it undermines the idea that the self is the agent of healing. But it can also be deeply relieving. It means you don't have to fix everything. You don't have to understand everything. You don't even have to be present for some of the most important work your mind does. You just have to get out of the way. Sleep does that for you, automatically, night after night. Which brings us back to the idea of sleep as a temporary death. Not because something is destroyed, but because something relinquishes control. The self steps aside, the light dims, and a deeper system takes over. A system that does not need identity to function. A system that does not worry about meaning. A system that works in silence. This may be why people who experience moments of deep peace during meditation or absorption often describe them as sleep-like even when awake, not because they are unconscious, but because the self is absent. Awareness remains, but it is unclaimed. No one is saying, "This is happening to me." There is just happening. Sleep is the most complete version of this state, because it removes even the impulse to notice. And yet, when you wake up, you carry its effects with you, calm without explanation, stability without effort. The self returns lighter, not because it learned something, but because it rested. And this leads to a question that becomes harder to ignore the more we follow it. If consciousness can exist without a self, and functioning can occur without identity, and healing can happen without awareness, then what is the self actually for? What role does it play that cannot be fulfilled by these deeper layers? And why does it insist on being at the center of experience when, clearly, experience does not depend on it? To answer that, we may need to look not at sleep itself, but at what sleep makes possible, especially the strange rule-bending world that emerges when fragments of identity return without structure, the world of dreams. There is a moment after the self dissolves, but before it disappears completely. A strange interval where identity loosens its grip, yet something that resembles identity still moves. This is where dreams begin. Dreams are often misunderstood as stories the sleeping mind tells itself, but that description gives them too much structure and too much intention, because dreams do not behave like stories. They don't respect sequence. They don't preserve logic. They don't protect character consistency. And most importantly, they don't require you to be you. In dreams, identity becomes fluid. You might be present without a body. You might have a body that isn't yours. You might be watching yourself from the outside or moving through scenes with no sense of perspective at all. Sometimes you are the main character. Sometimes you are no one in particular. Sometimes you are only movement. And none of this feels strange until you wake up. This is important because it suggests that the dream world is not a breakdown of the mind. It is a world where the rules of the waking self no longer apply. The self, as we experience it during the day, depends on continuity. I am the same person I was yesterday. I remember what I did. I anticipate what I will do. Dreams do not preserve this continuity. They recycle fragments of memory without caring who they belong to. They merge faces. They shift locations mid-scene. They collapse timelines. And yet, while dreaming, none of this feels wrong, which raises a subtle question. If the self were essential to coherent experience, dreams would feel unbearable, chaotic, disorienting, terrifying. But for most people, dreams feel immersive. Sometimes emotional, sometimes absurd, sometimes neutral, but rarely impossible. This suggests that the mind is perfectly capable of generating experience without a stable self. Dreams are not the self acting strangely. They are experience occurring after the self has loosened, but before it has vanished completely. A halfway state, a place where fragments of identity drift without being assembled into a single center. Think about how often you say, "I had a dream." That phrasing assumes ownership. But during the dream, ownership is vague at best. You don't think, "This is happening to me." You think, "This is happening." The self as a reference point is optional. Sometimes it appears briefly. Sometimes it dissolves again. Dreams are not consistent because the self is not consistent. It is unstable in this state, which may be exactly the point. Dreaming seems to be what happens when the brain begins reactivating fragments of identity without reassembling the full structure. Memory returns before narrative. Emotion returns before logic. Imagery returns before meaning. The pieces are there, but the glue is missing. And without the glue, identity cannot hold. This may be why dreams feel symbolic rather than literal. They are not trying to tell a story. They are reorganizing fragments. The waking self wants interpretation. It wants to decode dreams, assign meaning, extract messages. But that desire belongs to the daytime self. The dreaming mind is not speaking in messages. It is moving material, like a system defragmenting itself. During the day, experiences are logged according to personal relevance. This happened to me. This mattered to me. This hurt me. This helped me. At night, relevance dissolves. The brain doesn't ask who something belongs to. It asks how things connect. This is why dream logic feels emotional rather than rational. Scenes shift because emotion shifts. Characters change because associations change. Identity is not the anchor. Feeling is, and feeling does not require a self. You can feel fear in a dream without knowing who is afraid. You can feel joy without knowing who is happy. You can feel urgency without knowing what is at stake. The emotions exist without ownership, which reveals something important. The self is not the source of emotion. It is the organizer of emotion into a personal narrative. Remove the narrative, and emotion still flows. This may be unsettling if you are used to thinking of yourself as the center of experience. But it is also liberating, because it means that suffering is not inherent to emotion. Suffering arises when emotion is anchored to identity, when fear becomes my fear, when regret becomes my regret, when desire becomes my lack. Dreams strip away that ownership. This is why nightmares can be intense but strangely impersonal. You may wake up shaken, heart racing, body tense, but the fear does not always linger the way waking anxiety does, because the self was not fully present to claim it. Dream fear burns fast and dissipates. Waking fear embeds itself. Dreams show us what emotion looks like without identity management. And this tells us something profound about sleep. Sleep is not just the absence of waking consciousness. It is a different mode of organization, a mode where the self is optional. During deep sleep, even this mode collapses. But dreams occupy the threshold. They are the self, disassembled. Pieces floating without hierarchy. This is why you can be someone else in a dream and not question it. The self that questions identity is offline. The self that says, "This doesn't make sense," is absent. Only experience remains. And experience does not demand explanation, it simply unfolds. Notice how this contrasts with the waking mind. During the day, confusion is uncomfortable. In dreams, confusion is normal. During the day, contradictions are stressful. In dreams, contradictions coexist peacefully. During the day, identity must be stable. In dreams, identity is negotiable. This flexibility is not a flaw. It is a feature of a mind no longer constrained by survival-focused identity. Dreams do not need to protect you. They do not need to prepare you. They do not need to maintain coherence for others. They are private reorganizations, internal housekeeping, and they occur precisely because the self has stepped aside enough to allow them. Which leads to a question we rarely ask. If the mind can operate this fluidly without a stable self, why does the self insist on returning every morning? Why reassemble something that can be so easily taken apart? The answer may lie not in truth, but in necessity. The waking world demands accountability. Someone must be responsible. Someone must be consistent. Someone must remember. Dreams don't need responsibility. Sleep doesn't need consistency. The world does, so the self returns. But its absence at night reveals its nature. It is not the essence of mind. It is a role the mind plays when required. Dreams are the mind rehearsing life without that role, testing what happens when identity is loosened, exploring possibilities without consequence. This may be why creativity often emerges from dreams. Ideas appear unfiltered. Connections form without permission, because the self, which normally polices relevance and appropriateness, is not present to interfere. Dreams are not meaningful because they predict the future. They are meaningful because they show us what the mind is capable of without identity constraints. And yet, dreams are still not the deepest state. They still involve imagery, emotion, movement. They are still something. There is a deeper absence beyond them, a place where even these fragments dissolve, where there is no image to watch, no feeling to experience, no sense of drifting, only rest. That place is harder to describe because it leaves no trace. But dreams point toward it. They are the last echoes of identity before silence, which brings us closer to the quietest part of sleep, the part with no story, no imagery, no emotion, the part people call dreamless sleep. And if dreams show us what experience looks like without a stable self, what does experience look like when even experience itself seems to disappear? What remains when the mind stops producing images altogether? And if nothing appears to remain, why does that nothing feel so deeply restorative? That is where the next door opens. There is something else that quietly disappears when the self loosens its grip. Not thought, not emotion, not even fear. What disappears is judgment. In the dream state, and even more clearly in deeper stages of sleep, The rules that govern waking life simply stop applying. Right and wrong blur. Appropriate and inappropriate lose meaning. Responsibility dissolves. This is not because the mind becomes careless. It is because morality, as we experience it, depends on identity. Morality requires a someone who acts, someone who chooses, someone who can be praised or blamed. When the self weakens, this structure collapses. Think about your dreams. You may do things there that would horrify your waking mind. You may lie, you may run, you may harm, you may abandon. And yet, while dreaming, you rarely feel guilt in the way you do when awake. Emotion may arise, fear, excitement, urgency, but moral weight does not. You do not pause to ask, should I be doing this? You do not stop to consider consequences. You act, or things happen, without ownership. And this absence is revealing, because it shows that morality is not a fundamental property of experience. It is a social structure built on continuity of self. In waking life, morality serves a purpose. It regulates behavior in a shared world. It creates predictability. It assigns responsibility. For morality to function, there must be a stable identity over time. The same person who acted yesterday must be accountable today. The same self who intends must be capable of regret. Sleep breaks that continuity. There is no persistent actor, no stable character moving through time. So the rules lose their anchor. This does not mean the sleeping mind is immoral. It means morality is irrelevant when identity is absent. Just as traffic laws are irrelevant when there are no roads, in deep sleep there is no self to govern, so judgment shuts down. This explains something subtle but important. Why dreams feel free in a way waking life rarely does. Not free as in joyful, free as in unburdened. Unburdened by the need to justify. Unburdened by the need to be consistent. Unburdened by the need to maintain a moral position. The self spends enormous energy during the day managing this burden. Was that the right thing to say? Did I act correctly? How will this be judged later? This constant evaluation is exhausting, and it cannot occur without identity. You must know who you are to know how you should behave. Remove the self, and the entire evaluative framework collapses. This is why sleep feels like relief, not just from worry, but from responsibility. You are not responsible for your dreams. You are not held accountable for what happens in them. Even nightmares do not carry moral consequences. They end. You wake. Nothing follows you out. This is not an accident. It is a feature of a system that temporarily suspends moral bookkeeping, and that suspension is essential because moral identity is heavy. It requires constant monitoring of behavior, constant comparison to internal standards, constant anticipation of judgment by others and by yourself. Without a break, this system would overload. Sleep provides that break, not by resolving moral conflict, but by removing the moral agent, you. This can feel unsettling to acknowledge, because we like to believe that morality is who we are, that our values define us, that even in unconsciousness, something ethical remains intact. But sleep suggests otherwise. Ethics do not survive without identity. They do not need to. They are tools for waking life. In the absence of a social world, morality has no function, which raises an uncomfortable question. If morality disappears when the self disappears, what does that say about the nature of the self itself? Is the self the source of morality, or merely its container? Perhaps morality is not a deep truth embedded in consciousness, but a system layered on top of experience to regulate interaction. Necessary, important, but conditional. This does not diminish morality's value, it clarifies its role. Morality is not the foundation of existence, it is the architecture of coexistence. Sleep is existence without coexistence. There is no society in sleep, no audience, no consequence, so the architecture dissolves. And what remains is not chaos, it is neutrality. Things happen without being labeled as good or bad, which brings us to something even more subtle. In sleep, not only does judgment vanish, so does shame. Shame is one of the most self-dependent emotions we have. It requires an internal observer, someone who watches you act and evaluates you from the inside. In dreams, this observer is often absent. You may be exposed, you may be seen, but the sense of being judged as yourself is missing. Shame requires memory, identity, and imagined social consequence. Sleep strips these away, and the relief from shame is profound. Many people carry shame so deeply that they barely notice it anymore. It becomes a background hum. Sleep silences that hum completely, not temporarily, not partially, completely. For several hours each night, you are not someone who has failed. You are not someone who should be different. You are not someone who must improve. You are no one, and that nothingness is kind. This may explain why people often wake from deep sleep feeling reset, even if life remains difficult. It is not optimism, it is the absence of self-evaluation. For a while, the inner critic was gone, and the critic is part of the self. It exists to enforce standards, to align behavior with identity, to prevent deviation. In waking life, this has value. In sleep, it is unnecessary, so it vanishes, which leads to an insight that is easy to miss. The self is not just the thing that says I am, it is also the thing that says I should. When the self dissolves, should dissolves with it. No obligation, no expectation, just being, without direction. This is why sleep can feel so deeply humane, because it gives you a break from being a moral project, from being someone who must constantly become better. Sleep says, quietly, you do not need to be anything right now, and yet when you wake, the moral framework returns instantly. Responsibility snaps back into place. Judgment resumes. Standards reassert themselves, because waking life demands them. But now we are faced with another question. If morality is suspended in sleep and responsibility dissolves without harm, and the world inside you continues to function, what does that imply about free will, choice, agency? Because morality assumes choice. It assumes you could have done otherwise. But in sleep, there is no choosing. Things simply happen, and this happening does not feel wrong, which suggests that agency itself may be tied to the self in ways we rarely examine. Perhaps the self is not just an identity, but the mechanism through which responsibility and choice are constructed. And if that mechanism can be turned off so completely, what does that say about how real our sense of control actually is? Because in sleep, control is gone, and yet nothing essential breaks. In fact, something essential improves. The mind stabilizes, the body repairs, the system recalibrates, all without choice, all without agency, which leads us toward a question that feels increasingly difficult to avoid. If the self is required for morality, and morality is required for society, and society is required for survival, then perhaps the self exists not because it is the truth of who you are, but because it is necessary for living among others. A social construct generated internally, useful, powerful, but not fundamental. Sleep reveals what happens when that construct is removed, not as a philosophical argument, but as a lived nightly experiment. And the result of that experiment is always the same. You disappear. Judgment disappears. Responsibility disappears. And in that absence, there is no collapse, only rest. Which brings us closer to the deepest question yet. If morality, judgment, and responsibility are functions of the waking self, what is the self ultimately protecting? What is it afraid would happen if it did not return each morning to take its place? Because something about the self seems urgent. It insists on coming back, on reasserting control, on rebuilding the rules, as if without it, something essential would be lost. But sleep suggests otherwise. It suggests that the self is not guarding existence, it is guarding continuity. The continuity that allows a person to exist in time. And if that continuity can be broken every night without harm, then what, exactly, are we so afraid of losing when we imagine letting go of ourselves for just a little longer? That question does not demand an answer yet, but it opens a door into the next layer of this inquiry, where we begin to look not at morality or judgment, but at the body itself. Because while the self disappears, the body remains. And the body, unlike the self, never asks who it is. It simply continues, and that fact changes everything. While the self dissolves, the body never leaves. This is easy to overlook, because the waking mind tends to treat the body as something it has, rather than something it is. A vehicle, a container, a tool the self uses to move through the world. But sleep quietly reverses this relationship. When the self disappears, the body remains fully active, not passively, not mechanically, actively. Breathing adjusts to microscopic changes in chemistry. The heart fine-tunes its rhythm without instruction. Cells repair damage, replace proteins, reorganize themselves. All of this happens without permission, without awareness, without identity. The body does not ask who it is. It does not need to. This contrast is revealing, because the self spends much of its time asking questions the body never asks. Who am I? Am I doing this right? What does this mean? What should happen next? The body asks none of these. It responds. It adapts. It continues, which raises a quiet but radical question. What if the body is not something the self controls, but something the self occasionally interferes with? During the day, the self overlays intention onto bodily processes. You decide when to move. You decide when to eat. You decide when to stop. But beneath these decisions, the body is already doing its own work. It regulates temperature. It maintains balance. It adjusts posture without conscious thought. Sleep removes the overlay. The self steps aside, and the body resumes full authority. And under that authority, nothing collapses. In fact, things improve. This challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that without conscious control, systems degrade. Sleep shows the opposite. Without conscious control, systems optimize. The body knows how to heal itself better when the self is absent. This is not poetry. It is observation. People deprived of sleep heal more slowly. Their immune systems weaken. Their emotions destabilize. Not because the body forgot how to function, but because the self never let go. The body requires periods without identity management to do its deepest work. Identity is expensive. It consumes energy. It demands constant monitoring. It pulls attention away from internal maintenance. Sleep removes that cost. For several hours each night, the body is free from being represented. No image, no narrative, no performance, just process. And process does not need meaning. This might explain something subtle about how illness feels. When you are sick, the body demands rest. Not thinking, not planning, not explaining, rest. The self often resists this demand. It worries about productivity. It worries about falling behind. It worries about what being sick says about you. But the body does not care what sickness means. It only cares about correction. Sleep is the body's preferred condition for correction, which suggests that sleep is not primarily for the mind at all. It is for the body. The mind benefits indirectly. This may sound counterintuitive because sleep feels mental. Dreams, thoughts fading, awareness shifting. But those are side effects. The core activity of sleep is physical. Neural connections are strengthened or weakened. Hormones are regulated. Metabolic waste is cleared. The self has no role in these processes. It cannot supervise them. It cannot speed them up. It cannot understand them fully. So it is removed. And this removal is not experienced as loss. It is experienced as sinking, as heaviness, as letting go, because the self's grip on the body relaxes. During the day, the self holds the body in a state of readiness. Muscles are slightly tense. Attention is outward facing. Posture is optimized for action. At night, readiness dissolves. Muscles release not because you tell them to, but because no one is asking them to be ready. This is why people who are anxious often feel physically tense even at rest. The self is on duty. Sleep sends it home. The body exhales, and in that exhale, something else becomes clear. The body does not experience time the way the self does. For the self, time is a line, a sequence of moments, a path from past to future. For the body, time is rhythmic, cycles, repeats, oscillations, heartbeat, breathing, hormonal pulses. Sleep aligns the mind with this rhythm. The linear narrative of the self pauses. The cyclical intelligence of the body takes over. This may be why deep sleep feels timeless, not long, not short, just absent. Time, as a story, requires a self moving through it. Without the self, there is no movement to track, only repetition, which is why sleep feels like sinking into something ancient, something older than memory. The body has been sleeping for millions of years, long before there were stories, long before there were names. Sleep belongs to the body's lineage, not the self's. The self is a recent development, a layer added for social navigation. Sleep removes the newer layer and reveals the older one beneath. This reversal can feel threatening to the waking self, because it implies that the body does not need identity to exist. That existence precedes explanation, that living comes before meaning. This is deeply uncomfortable for a culture that places identity at the center of everything. Who are you? What do you do? What do you believe? The body answers none of these. It simply persists. And every night, sleep returns you to that persistence. Without commentary, without justification, just functioning. This might be why sleep is often described using spatial metaphors. Falling asleep, drifting off, going under, as if you are returning to a deeper layer of yourself. But that phrasing is misleading, because it assumes there is still a you making the journey. In reality, the journey is the disappearance of the traveler. What remains is the terrain, the body, which never left. This reframes the idea of sleep as a temporary death. It is not the death of the body, it is the death of representation. The body continues without being represented as mine, and this lack of ownership is liberating. Pain, when it appears in sleep, is different. Sensation exists, but it is not interpreted. The self does not say, "This is happening to me." It simply happens. And without interpretation, intensity does not necessarily become suffering. Suffering requires ownership. Sleep suspends ownership. Which is why even physical discomfort can feel less distressing when half asleep. The body feels, the self does not react. This separation reveals something important. The self does not create sensation. It amplifies it. It wraps sensation in meaning. This hurts because it threatens me. This feels good because it satisfies me. Remove the self, and sensation returns to neutrality. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just information. The body understands information. It does not need a story. And when sleep allows the body to operate without story, healing accelerates, which brings us back to a deeper tension. The waking self believes it is essential. It believes it must be present for life to function. Sleep disproves this belief nightly. Life functions better without it, at least for a while. This does not mean the self is unnecessary. It means it is not foundational. The body is foundational. The self is a layer, a powerful one, a useful one, but removable. And that removability is not a bug. It is a safeguard. Because a system that cannot shut down will eventually fail. Sleep ensures the system resets. By returning authority to the body, this might explain why chronic sleep deprivation is so destabilizing, not just physically, but existentially. When the self never fully dissolves, it begins to believe it is all there is. It over-identifies. It tightens its grip, and that grip creates suffering. Sleep loosens the grip by force, night after night, no matter how much the self resists. Which suggests that the self is not in control of its own disappearance. Something deeper decides when it must go. The body. The body knows when identity has become too expensive, when representation is draining resources, when it is time to return to baseline. Sleep is the body reclaiming the system, and when the body reclaims the system, it does not ask permission. It simply waits until resistance weakens. Then it takes over. This raises a question that feels increasingly unavoidable. If the body can function so effectively without the self, if healing, regulation, and balance occur without identity, then what is the relationship between the body and the self during waking life? Is the self the driver, or is it a passenger who believes it is steering? Because if the body can take control so completely at night, what else might it be capable of during the day if the self would only loosen its grip? That question does not ask for immediate answers. It asks for a shift in perspective, a recognition that the self may not be the master of the system, just a manager with limited authority. Sleep reminds us of that hierarchy, gently, relentlessly, every night. And as we move deeper into this inquiry, one thing becomes clearer. The self is not the center of existence. It is a function, a role that appears when needed and disappears when not. The body does not fear this disappearance. It relies on it, which brings us to the next layer of this exploration. If the body remains and the self dissolves, what happens to memory? Because memory is where the self believes it lives. In the story of who you are, And if memory changes in sleep, then the self that returns in the morning may not be the same one that left. That is where the next door opens. If the self believes it lives anywhere, it believes it lives in memory. Your name, your history, your preferences, your regrets, all of it seems to be stored there. Memory gives the self continuity. It allows yesterday to reach into today. It allows today to matter tomorrow. Without memory, the self cannot persist, and sleep changes memory in ways the waking self never witnesses, because while the self dissolves, memory does not simply shut down, it reorganizes. During the day, memory behaves like an archive arranged around relevance to identity. What happened to me? What mattered to me? What threatened me? What confirmed who I am? Experiences are tagged, prioritized, sorted according to how they support or challenge the ongoing story of the self. But when the self disappears at night, that organizing principle vanishes. Memory is freed from identity. And something very different happens. Experiences are no longer grouped by personal importance. They are grouped by pattern, emotions linked to emotions, images linked to images, sensations linked to sensations. The question is no longer, what does this mean about me? The question becomes, what fits with what? This shift is subtle but profound, because it means that memory does not inherently belong to the self. The self borrows memory during the day. Sleep returns it to a deeper system. You can feel the effects of this without knowing how it works. Have you ever gone to sleep overwhelmed by a problem only to wake up with a clearer perspective? Not a solution, but a rebalancing. The problem feels smaller, less entangled, less personal. That change did not come from conscious reasoning. It came from memory being reorganized without identity as the reference point. Sleep does not erase memory. It loosens its attachment to the self. And in doing so, it changes the self itself. This is why you're never quite the same person 2 days in a row. The self feels continuous, but it is rebuilt daily from memory that has been subtly altered overnight. Connections are strengthened or weakened. Some details fade, others become more accessible. This is not accidental. The brain does not store memory to preserve identity. It stores memory to optimize functioning. Identity is secondary. When the self is absent, memory is no longer obligated to protect a personal narrative. It is allowed to reorganize freely. This may be why dreams feel so strange. They draw from memory that is no longer arranged around you. Faces blend, places merge, events repeat with variations. The waking self would never allow this level of distortion. It needs clarity. It needs consistency. Sleep does not. Sleep prioritizes integration over accuracy. This distinction matters. Accuracy serves identity. Integration serves stability. And stability does not require a coherent story. It requires balance. This is why emotionally charged memories often soften after sleep. Not because they are forgotten, but because they are no longer isolated. They are woven into a broader network of associations. The pain becomes contextualized, no longer the center. And when the self returns in the morning, it retrieves these memories from a slightly altered landscape. The facts may be the same, but the weight has shifted. This is why people say, sleep on it. Not because sleep gives you answers, but because it changes the self who will ask the question. Memory is not static storage. It is active reconstruction. And sleep is when most of that reconstruction occurs. But here is the unsettling part. You're not present for it. The self is offline. which means the self has no say in how its own story is being edited. This challenges another assumption the self holds dearly: that it is the author of its own narrative. Sleep reveals that authorship is shared and often overridden. The mind edits the story of you without consulting you. It removes redundancies. It weakens unhelpful loops. It strengthens useful patterns, all without asking whether this aligns with how you see yourself. And when you wake up, you inherit the result. This may be why identity feels both familiar and slightly unstable. You recognize yourself, but you also notice subtle shifts. You care less about something, more about something else. You feel drawn toward or away from things without knowing why. These changes did not come from choice. They came from memory being reorganized while the self was gone, which suggests something radical. The self is not the curator of memory. It is a user interface, a way of accessing what memory provides. But the underlying system operates independently. Sleep exposes this hierarchy. Memory persists without identity. Identity depends on memory, not the other way around. This means the self is not stored anywhere. It is assembled. Each morning, memory offers a configuration, and the self emerges from it. But that configuration is never identical to the one before. Small changes accumulate, and over time, the self evolves, not through decision, but through reorganization. This is why long periods of sleep deprivation can feel disorienting at a personal level. When memory is not allowed to reorganize, the self becomes rigid. Thoughts loop, emotions get stuck, identity hardens. Without nightly reconstruction, the self loses flexibility. It becomes brittle. Sleep restores plasticity by temporarily removing the structure that demands consistency. This plasticity is essential because the world changes, circumstances shift, people grow. A self that cannot change becomes a source of suffering. Sleep ensures change happens whether the self wants it or not. And the self often resists this. It clings to identity. It wants to remain who it believes it is. But sleep undermines that attachment gently, repeatedly. Each night, it says, you are allowed to loosen. You are allowed to be reorganized. You do not need to supervise your own continuity. This may be why people who are deeply attached to their identity often struggle with sleep. The self does not want to be edited. It fears loss of control. But the system is larger than the self, and the system prioritizes balance over narrative. Memory serves the system, not the story, which leads us back to the idea of sleep as a temporary death, not the death of the body, not the death of consciousness, but the death of authorship. For several hours, the story of you is not being told. It is being rewritten, silently, without commentary. And you never witness the process. You only wake up inside the revised version. This can feel unsettling if you think of yourself as fixed, but it can feel deeply reassuring if you see yourself as adaptive, because it means you are not trapped by yesterday, not entirely. Each night, something loosens. Each night, something is rebalanced. Each night, the self dies just enough for the story to breathe. And when the self returns, it returns altered, slightly more flexible, slightly less burdened, slightly less certain of its own permanence. Which brings us to a question that becomes sharper now. If memory reshapes the self while the self is absent, if identity is rebuilt daily without conscious input, then what does it really mean to say, I am the same person. And what does it mean to fear losing yourself when you are, in fact, being remade every night? That question does not ask for comfort. It asks for honesty, and it leads us deeper still. Because memory is not the only thing sleep reorganizes. There is something even more fundamental that shifts when the self dissolves, something that defines how you relate to the future. Something that gives the self its sense of direction, time itself. And when time changes, the self can no longer stand where it thinks it stands. That is where the next door opens. Time feels solid while you're awake. It feels like something you move through, something that carries you forward whether you want it to or not, something that presses on you with urgency, deadlines, aging, waiting, regret. All of these experiences assume one thing, that there is a self traveling along a timeline, a me who was here before, who is here now, and who must arrive somewhere later. Time, as you experience it during the day, is inseparable from identity. But sleep quietly dismantles this structure. In deep sleep, time does not pass in any way you can recognize. Not slowly, not quickly, not at all. You do not feel hours accumulate. You do not feel distance traveled. You close your eyes, and suddenly it is morning. This collapse is not an illusion of memory. It is a real shift in how time is processed. Because time, like morality and worry, depends on the self. Time requires sequence, before and after, cause and effect. And sequence requires a stable reference point, a someone to move from one moment to the next. When the self dissolves, that reference point disappears. And without a reference point, time loses meaning. The body continues to operate in cycles. Breath follows breath. Heartbeat follows heartbeat. But these are rhythms, not timelines. They do not point forward. They repeat. For the body, time is not a line. It is a loop. The waking self overlays a linear narrative onto this loop. It turns rhythm into progress. Yesterday becomes behind you. Tomorrow becomes ahead of you. Sleep removes that overlay, and what remains is not timelessness in a mystical sense, but non-linear functioning. Nothing is moving toward anything. Things are simply happening. This may be why sleep feels so restorative, because the self spends much of its energy trying to outrun time, trying to keep up, trying not to fall behind, trying to reach a future that always recedes. In sleep, there is no race, no finish line, no direction. The self is released from forward motion. This release is deeper than rest. It is a suspension of becoming. During the day, the self is always becoming something better, worse, older, closer, further away. Becoming is exhausting. It requires constant comparison between now and then. Sleep removes then. There is no then in deep sleep. There is no later self to worry about, no earlier self to compare against. Only functioning without direction. This explains something subtle, why the fear of death feels so closely tied to the fear of time. We imagine death as the end of our timeline. The self resists this idea because the self is a timeline. Without time, the self cannot exist. Sleep gives us a nightly rehearsal of this loss. The timeline stops, and yet nothing catastrophic occurs. You do not experience non-existence as terror. You do not experience it at all, which suggests that the fear of time ending belongs entirely to the waking self. It is a fear generated by continuity. Sleep shows what happens when continuity is suspended. There is no fear, not courage, not acceptance, just absence. This absence is not something you can remember, because memory itself depends on time. But you wake knowing you rested, knowing something essential occurred. This knowledge does not come from recollection, it comes from the body. The body understands time differently. It does not anticipate. It does not regret. It responds to cycles. Sleep aligns the mind with that cyclical intelligence, which may be why people often feel more grounded after sleep, less scattered, less urgent. Time feels slower, not because the world changed, but because the self's grip on the timeline loosened. The self constructs urgency by projecting itself forward. What if this happens? What if I don't make it? What if I run out of time? Sleep dissolves the projection. There is no future self to defend. So urgency collapses. This does not mean that time is an illusion. It means that time is not experienced the same way without identity. Time exists as measurement, as physics. But psychological time, the time that pressures you, is a construction of the self. Sleep reveals this by removing the constructor. And when you wake up, the constructor returns. The timeline rebuilds itself. Plans come back online. Deadlines reassert themselves. Age feels real again. But something has changed. Because for several hours, you existed without time. Not frozen, not paused, operating. This creates a quiet contradiction. If you can exist without experiencing time, then time is not required for existence. It is required for narrative. The self needs narrative. It needs to know where it has been and where it is going. Sleep is existence without narrative, which may explain why people describe deep sleep as empty and full at the same time. Empty of content, full of restoration. Nothing happened, yet everything reset. This paradox makes sense when you stop assuming that existence must involve a story. The story is optional, useful during the day, unnecessary at night. The self clings to time because time gives it a sense of purpose. Without a future, the self has no task. Without a past, it has no justification. Sleep removes both, and the self, for a while, disappears. This is not nihilistic, it is functional. A system that never stops projecting forward will burn itself out. Sleep enforces a break, a return to baseline. This also reframes the idea of insomnia. Insomnia is not just difficulty sleeping, it is difficulty letting go of time. The mind keeps projecting, replaying, anticipating. The self refuses to stop moving forward, even when the body is ready to return to rhythm, which is why insomnia often feels like being stuck in tomorrow. Tomorrow's worries, tomorrow's consequences. Sleep can only arrive when tomorrow dissolves, when the timeline collapses. This is not something you can force. It happens when the self finally loosens its hold on sequence, when it stops insisting on continuity. Which brings us back to the idea of sleep as a temporary death. Death is often feared as the end of time, but sleep shows that the end of experienced time is not experienced as loss. It is experienced as rest. The self fears the loss of time because time is how it persists. Sleep gently contradicts that fear every night. You stop being a story in motion. You become a process in balance. And then, in the morning, the story resumes. But now, having been interrupted, this interruption is crucial because it prevents the self from fully identifying with time. It introduces a crack, a reminder that you're not only a trajectory, you are also a rhythm. This may be why people who experience moments of deep presence often describe time as slowing down or disappearing. Those moments resemble sleep, not because consciousness fades, but because the self releases its grip on the timeline. Presence is time without narrative. Sleep is presence without awareness. Both reveal the same truth from different angles. That time, as suffering, belongs to identity. And when identity dissolves, time loses its power. This does not mean you can live without time while awake. The world requires it. But it does mean that time is not the ultimate container of your existence. Sleep proves that nightly. You step out of time, and you return unharmed. Which leads us to a quieter, more intimate question. If time dissolves with the self, and the self dissolves in sleep, and nothing essential is lost, then why does waking life feel so heavy with urgency? Why does the self cling so desperately to the timeline? What is it trying to protect? Because something about the self seems afraid. Afraid of stopping, afraid of silence, afraid of dissolution. And if sleep is safe, what exactly is the self afraid will happen if it lets go completely? That fear does not live in the body. The body sleeps easily. It lives in the self. And to understand it, we need to look at the one thing the self values above all else: continuity, the belief that it must remain intact, the belief that if it stops, something irreplaceable will be lost. That belief shapes how we live, how we worry, and how we resist rest. And it is that belief that the next chapter will begin to examine. There is a particular kind of suffering that only appears when sleep fails. Not pain, not sadness, a tension that feels more existential than emotional. Because when you cannot sleep, it is not just your body that stays awake. It is the self, and the self does not know how to rest. Insomnia is often described as a problem of the mind. Too many thoughts, too much worry. But beneath those descriptions is something simpler and more disturbing. The self refuses to disappear. Night arrives, the body slows, the world quiets, but the self remains standing, alert, guarding something it cannot name. It keeps thinking not because it enjoys thinking, but because thinking is how it stays intact. Every thought reinforces continuity. Every memory recalled confirms identity. Every plan for tomorrow reasserts direction. To stop thinking would be to risk dissolution. And the self is built to resist that. This is why insomnia often feels like vigilance rather than restlessness, as if something must be watched, as if letting go would be dangerous. But dangerous to whom? The body is ready to sleep. Breathing wants to slow. Muscles want to release. It is the self that cannot trust the darkness, because darkness feels like absence, and absence feels like annihilation to a structure that depends on being present. The self is not afraid of sleep itself. It is afraid of what sleep implies, that it is not essential, that life continues without it, that the system does not collapse when identity steps aside. Insomnia is the self trying to prove its necessity. It keeps the lights on, keeps narrating, keeps producing meaning, as if meaning could prevent disappearance. This is why people who struggle with insomnia often report a strange fear, not always conscious, that if they stop thinking, something bad will happen. Not a specific event, not a nightmare, just something. That something is the loss of control, because control is the self's primary function. During the day, control keeps you alive in a complex world. It helps you plan, predict, protect. At night, control becomes irrelevant. There is nothing to manage. And when control is no longer needed, the controller panics. Insomnia is not failure to sleep. It is resistance to surrender. And surrender is precisely what sleep requires, not effort, not technique. Release, which is why trying harder to sleep often makes insomnia worse. Trying is an act of the self. The more you try, the more present the self becomes. The self cannot will its own disappearance. It can only exhaust itself. Eventually, even vigilance runs out of energy. The self cannot stay awake forever. The body waits patiently. And when the self weakens enough, sleep takes over. Not because the self agreed, but because it was outlasted. This dynamic reveals something important. The self does not choose when it sleeps. Sleep happens when resistance collapses. This is not weakness, it is design, a system that allows its identity manager to decide when to shut down would never shut down at all. So sleep is enforced, night after night, against the will of the self. This enforcement can feel threatening when the self is overly active, which may explain why insomnia is often linked to periods of intense identity pressure, major life changes, loss, failure, anticipation, moments when the self feels unstable, when who you are is uncertain. The self works harder to stay assembled, it tightens its grip, and the tighter it grips, the harder it is to sleep. Because sleep requires loosening, this creates a painful loop. The more exhausted you are, the more you need the self to disappear. But the more exhausted you are, the more desperately the self tries to hold on, because exhaustion threatens identity. You begin to feel like you are unraveling, and the self interprets that as danger. So it stays awake to protect you from rest, from silence, from dissolution. This protection is misguided, but sincere. The self is not malicious. It is simply doing what it was built to do, preserve continuity. But continuity is not always beneficial. Sometimes it becomes a trap. This may be why people who finally overcome insomnia often describe it not as a victory of control, but as a moment of giving up. I stopped trying. I let it happen. I didn't care anymore. These are not strategies. They are descriptions of surrender. And surrender is the one thing the self cannot do intentionally. It only happens when the self loses interest in maintaining itself. This loss of interest can feel like defeat, but it is actually relief, because maintaining the self is exhausting. It requires constant attention. Sleep is the only state where that attention is fully withdrawn. Which is why chronic insomnia is so destabilizing. When the self never fully dissolves, it begins to believe it is permanent. It forgets that it is a role. It over-identifies. And over-identification magnifies suffering. Every thought feels urgent. Every emotion feels personal. Every setback feels catastrophic. Sleep normally interrupts this amplification. It resets scale. Without that reset, the self becomes brittle. This brittleness can feel like anxiety, depression, or derealization. But at its core, it is identity fatigue. The self is tired of being itself, and yet it cannot stop. Sleep is the only thing that stops it, which reframes insomnia in a gentler way, not as a failure of relaxation, but as a fear of letting go, a fear that belongs not to the body, but to the identity that believes it must remain vigilant at all times. This fear often goes unrecognized because it is not dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, a sense that rest must be earned, that it is unsafe to disappear. But sleep does not ask to be earned. It is not a reward. It is a biological necessity that bypasses permission. The body will take it when it must, even if the self resists. This can be reassuring, because it means that No matter how tightly the self clings, it cannot prevent dissolution forever. Eventually, something deeper intervenes, and when sleep finally arrives after insomnia, it is often deep, heavy, almost aggressive, as if the body is reclaiming territory. This is not punishment. It is correction, the system restoring balance. The self stepping aside because it has no choice. And in that forced surrender, something important happens. The self learns, without remembering, that it can disappear and return, that continuity can be broken and rebuilt, that nothing essential is lost. This learning does not occur consciously. It occurs structurally. The next time the self approaches sleep, it may resist a little less, not because it understands, but because it has been outlasted before. Sleep teaches the self humility, not through insight, through repetition, night after night, which leads us back to a question that is now sharper. If the self resists dissolution so strongly, what does it believe it is protecting? Why does it fear disappearing, even temporarily? What does the self imagine would be lost if it did not return intact? Because this fear is not abstract. It shapes how we live. It shapes how we work, worry, strive, and cling. It shapes our fear of death, our fear of silence, our fear of rest. And to understand it, we must look at what the self is built to preserve. Not the body. The body survives without it. Not consciousness. That continues without it. Not memory. That reorganizes without it. The self is protecting something else, something fragile, something social, something that only exists in relation to others. And that is where the next chapter leads, into the role the self plays not inside the body, but between bodies, between people, between eyes that look back. Because the self may not exist to keep you alive. It may exist to keep you recognizable, and if that recognition disappears, the self believes something essential is at risk. What that is, and why sleep can afford to let it go, is what we begin to explore next. The self does not exist in isolation. This may be the most difficult thing to accept about it, because from the inside, the self feels private, internal, hidden behind your eyes, but its true function is not inward, it is relational. The self exists because you are seen. From the moment you learn your name, identity becomes a response to recognition. Someone calls, you turn, the self forms. You're not born with a fully formed I. You grow into one through mirrors, faces that react, voices that respond, eyes that confirm you are there. The self is not what you are. It is how you appear, and more importantly, how you expect to appear. This is why the self works so hard. It is constantly anticipating judgment, not necessarily harsh judgment, often subtle, approval, disapproval, acceptance, rejection. The self monitors these possibilities at all times. How am I being perceived? How will this look? What will they think? Even when you are alone, the self continues this work. Because the audience has been internalized, the world follows you inside. This is why solitude does not automatically bring peace, because the self does not require physical others to function. It carries them within, but sleep removes the audience, not symbolically, structurally. When you sleep, there is no one to be seen by, no one to perform for, no one to disappoint, no one to impress. Even shame disappears, because shame is impossible without an imagined observer. This is why sleep feels so freeing, not because you escape your problems, but because you escape visibility. For several hours, you are unobserved, not watched, not evaluated, not interpreted. You are no longer an image, and the self, which is built entirely around being an image, dissolves. This reframes something important. The self is not the core of consciousness. It is the interface between consciousness and society. It allows you to be legible, predictable, accountable. The self answers questions like, who did this? Who is responsible? Who should be praised or blamed? These questions are meaningless in sleep. There is no social field, no exchange, no accountability. So the self has no role to play. This may explain why social anxiety often fades completely during deep sleep, not because the fear is resolved, but because the entire structure that generates the fear is gone. There is no imagined audience to worry about, no future interaction to rehearse. The self, whose job it is to prepare you for social reality, is offline. This also explains why dreams can involve other people without triggering the same self-consciousness. Faces appear, crowds gather, interactions unfold, but you are rarely embarrassed in the way you would be while awake, because the dreaming mind does not fully reconstruct the social self. There are characters, but no audience, no lasting reputation, no memory of being seen. The self is what allows you to exist between people. Sleep removes the between, and what remains is solitary existence, not lonely, but neutral. This distinction matters. Loneliness requires a self. It requires someone who feels separate from others. Sleep removes separateness by removing identity. There is no one to be alone. This may be why people experiencing profound loneliness often crave sleep, not because they want to escape others, but because they want to escape being separate. Sleep temporarily removes the boundaries that define me and them. And in that removal, there is relief. The self is built from difference. I am here, you are there, I am this, you are that. Sleep dissolves difference, not into unity exactly, but into irrelevance. Difference requires comparison. Comparison requires identity. Sleep suspends both. This also explains why the fear of social failure is so powerful, because the self believes its survival depends on recognition. If I am rejected, who am I? If I am ignored, do I exist? These fears are not irrational. They reflect the social origins of identity. The self exists because it is acknowledged. Sleep removes acknowledgement, and nothing bad happens. This is deeply unsettling to the self, because it implies that existence does not require recognition, that being does not depend on being seen, that you can disappear socially and still persist biologically, still function, still heal. Sleep proves this every night. You vanish from the social world. No messages, no roles, no performance, and in that vanishing, you recover. This does not mean society is unimportant. It means the self is specialized. It exists for interaction. It is not the ground of being. The ground of being does not care whether you are recognized. It cares whether you are regulated, balanced, alive. The self is the cost of participation. Sleep is the refund. This may be why people often wake from deep sleep with a subtle sense of courage, not confidence, courage, because for several hours they did not exist socially, and nothing broke. The fear of judgment loses some of its power when you realize, without thinking, that you can disappear and return. This realization does not become a belief. It becomes a felt memory, stored somewhere beneath thought, and this stored memory changes how the self behaves during the day. It may cling a little less, perform a little less, fear a little less, because it has been reminded that recognition is not the same as existence. Which brings us back to insomnia. Insomnia often intensifies when social identity is under threat, when reputation is at stake, when belonging feels uncertain, when the self fears being seen incorrectly. In these moments, the self cannot afford to disappear, because disappearing feels like social death. Even though sleep is not social death, it only feels that way to an identity built on visibility. Sleep asks the self to trust that it can step out of view, that it does not need to be watched to survive. That trust is difficult, especially in a world where visibility is currency, where being seen feels synonymous with being real. Sleep quietly contradicts that logic. You are real when no one sees you. You are functional when no one knows who you are. You are alive when no one remembers your name. This truth is not comforting to the self. It is liberating to what lies beneath it, which raises a subtle question. If the self exists to manage recognition and sleep removes recognition entirely, then what is sleep doing to your relationship with others? Why do people often wake feeling more patient, more forgiving, less reactive? Not always, but often, because the self has been reset. Its attachment to social evaluation has loosened. For a while, interactions feel lighter, less loaded. The self remembers dimly that recognition is not survival, that social failure is not annihilation. This memory fades as the day progresses. The self reasserts itself, but the trace remains, and this trace is essential. Without it, the self would harden, become rigid, become fearful. Sleep softens identity by reminding it, without words, that it is not the foundation of existence. Which leads us to the next quiet realization. If the self is a social interface and sleep removes the social world, then the self's fear of disappearing may not be about death at all. It may be about irrelevance, the fear of not mattering, the fear of not being recognized, the fear of not being remembered. Sleep confronts that fear gently. You are forgotten every night, and you return. Nothing essential is lost. This challenges one of the deepest assumptions of the self, that to stop being seen is to stop being. Sleep says otherwise, and in doing so, it prepares you, night after night, for something the self cannot imagine without fear. The possibility that existence does not require identity, that being precedes recognition, that you are not held together by being known. You are held together by something quieter, something that does not care whether you are visible, that something remains when the self dissolves. And if we follow this line of thought far enough, we arrive at a question that feels both intimate and unsettling. If the self exists for others and sleep removes others entirely, then who are you when there is no one left to recognize you? Not as a role, not as a name, not as an image. What remains when there is no audience at all? That question does not seek an answer you can think. It points toward a state you already enter every night, a state beyond recognition, beyond performance, beyond selfhood. And to approach it, we must look not outward, but inward, to the one thing the self believes defines it absolutely, the sense of agency, the feeling that you are the one who acts, because in sleep even that disappears. And when agency dissolves, the self loses its final claim to centrality. That is where the next chapter begins. There is one last thing the self clings to when everything else begins to fall away. Choice. The feeling that you are the one who decides, that actions originate from a center, that intentions arise from a core. That movement begins because you initiated it. Agency is the self's final claim to reality. Even when identity feels uncertain, even when memory blurs, even when recognition fades, the self says, "At least I am the one who acts." Sleep takes this too. Not suddenly, not violently. It loosens agency the same way it loosens thought, by making it unnecessary. Before sleep, you may still feel like you are choosing. Choosing when to turn over. Choosing to adjust the blanket. Choosing to close your eyes. But if you watch closely, something subtle begins to shift. Movements happen without deliberation. Breathing deepens without instruction. Muscles release without permission. You do not decide to stop holding tension. It stops being held. This is important because during the day, the self experiences agency as effort. You decide, you act. You cause things to happen, but beneath that effort, the body is already moving, reflexes fire, posture adjusts, eyes track motion. Most of what you do happens before you decide to do it. The self arrives late, claims authorship, and moves on. Sleep removes the need for that claim. There is no audience to credit, no narrative to maintain, so agency fades. This is why sleep paralysis feels so terrifying. The self wakes up partially while the body remains asleep. Agency is expected, but missing. You want to move, you cannot, and panic arises immediately, not because you're in danger, but because the self cannot tolerate losing control. Agency is the self's proof of existence. When that proof disappears, fear rushes in. But notice something else. In deep sleep, when the self is fully absent, there is no fear of lost agency, because there is no expectation of control. Fear only appears when the self returns too early, which suggests that agency itself is not fundamental. It is contextual. It exists when identity exists. When identity dissolves, agency dissolves with it, and nothing breaks. The body continues. The brain continues. Processes unfold. This challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions of waking life, that without agency, nothing meaningful can happen. Sleep disproves this every night. Meaningful things happen without choice. Healing, reorganization, integration. None of these require decision. They require conditions. Sleep provides those conditions by removing the decider. This reframes the question of free will in a quiet way, not as a philosophical debate, but as an experiential observation. In sleep, there is no free will, and yet life continues optimally, which suggests that free will is not the engine of existence. It is a tool for navigation in a social environment, useful, important, but not foundational. The self equates agency with selfhood. I act, therefore I am. Sleep answers differently. I function, therefore I am. No actor required. This is unsettling to the waking mind because so much identity is built around choice. What you chose to do, what you chose not to do, what you regret, what you take pride in. These choices form the moral spine of the self. Sleep temporarily removes that spine, not to punish, but to rest. This is why waking life feels lighter after good sleep, not because your choices are better, but because the weight of agency has been set down. For a while, you're not carrying the burden of being the one responsible for everything. You are simply present. This presence does not last. The self reclaims agency quickly, but it does so with a memory, not conscious, but structural, that agency can disappear without disaster. This memory softens control. It allows flexibility. It prevents the self from becoming tyrannical. Without sleep, agency hardens. Everything feels like a decision. Every outcome feels like a judgment. Burnout follows. Sleep resets agency by dissolving it. This also explains something subtle about dreaming. In dreams, things happen to you more than you make them happen. Even when you appear to act, the sense of authorship is weak. Scenes unfold. You respond. You rarely feel like the source. And this does not feel wrong. It feels normal, because agency is not expected in that state. Dreams are rehearsals of life without control. They show the mind how to experience without steering. This rehearsal is essential. Without it, the self would forget that letting go is possible. Which brings us back to the idea of sleep as a temporary death. Not the death of consciousness, not the death of the body, the death of authorship, of control, of the belief that something must always be steering. Sleep is what happens when the steering wheel is released and the system continues to function. This does not mean waking life should abandon agency. The world requires choice, but it does mean that agency is not the ground of being. It is a layer, a role played during interaction. Sleep removes interaction, so the role dissolves, and in that dissolution, something quieter emerges, a mode of existence without effort, without authorship, without pressure. This is deeply countercultural. We are taught to value control above all else, to be in charge, to direct our lives, to own our outcomes. Sleep contradicts this value nightly. It says, you do not need to be in charge all the time. You do not need to direct your existence. Some of the most important work happens when you are absent. This realization does not make the self irrelevant. It makes it humble. It places the self in context, a useful interface, not a ruler. This humility is what allows rest, which brings us to the edge of something even quieter. If identity dissolves and time collapses and memory reorganizes and agency disappears, what remains? Not philosophically, experientially, what is left when there is no one deciding, no one remembering, no one being seen? People often call this nothing, but that word belongs to the waking mind. It assumes absence must be empty. Sleep suggests otherwise, because you wake restored, which means something was there, something functioned, something held you, not as an identity, not as a self, but as a system deeper than selfhood. And to approach that system, we must let go of another assumption. That existence must be experienced to be real. Sleep challenges this too. Because the deepest sleep leaves no experience behind, no memory, no image, no feeling, and yet it is the most restorative of all. So what is the nature of this unexperienced existence? What does it mean to be without knowing that you are? That question cannot be answered directly. It can only be approached, and the approach begins in the next chapter, where we step beyond dreams, beyond agency, beyond selfhood, into the strange territory of dreamless sleep, where even experience itself seems to vanish, and yet something unmistakably remains. There is a place in sleep where even dreams do not go, a depth so quiet that nothing appears there at all. No images, no emotions, no movement, not even darkness. Dreamless sleep is not blackness. Blackness is still something you can notice. This state leaves no trace because there is no one there to witness it. And yet, when you wake from it, you know, without memory, that you have been deeply restored. This is the paradox. How can something you never experienced be the most nourishing state you enter? The waking self struggles with this question because it equates reality with experience. If I didn't see it, if I didn't feel it, if I can't remember it, how could it have mattered? But sleep tells a different story. The most important processes do not require witnesses. In dreamless sleep, the mind does not create a world. It does not simulate. It does not narrate. It simply stops producing content. This is not absence as failure. It is absence as completion. Think about how noise works. When a machine stops rattling, you do not say, "The machine has disappeared." You say, "It has settled." Dreamless sleep is the settling of the mind. No projections, no rehearsals, no identity fragments drifting, just baseline functioning. The self cannot imagine this because imagination requires content. The self cannot remember this because memory requires experience. So the self calls it nothing. But nothing is only a label for what cannot be brought back. It does not mean nothing happened. In fact, everything that could not happen while the self was present happens here. The brain clears waste. Neural connections rebalance. Hormonal systems recalibrate. This is not thinking. This is maintenance. And maintenance does not announce itself. It does not need interpretation. It needs conditions. Dreamless sleep provides those conditions by removing every layer that could interfere. This is why deep sleep is fragile. A small disturbance can pull you out of it. A noise, a light, a sudden thought. Because those disturbances reactivate the self. They bring content back online. And with content comes identity. With identity comes separation. With separation comes effort. Deep sleep cannot coexist with effort. It requires total release. This release is so complete that even awareness seems to vanish. But notice something important. When awareness returns, it returns smoothly. There is no panic, no sense of loss. You do not wake up thinking, "I was gone and now I'm back." You simply arrive. This suggests that the absence of awareness was not experienced as absence. It was experienced as nothing at all, which is not frightening. Fear requires awareness. Fear requires a self to feel threatened. Dreamless sleep removes both. This is why people who fear death often find an unexpected calm in deep sleep, not because sleep answers the fear, but because it reveals a state where the fear has no place to exist. Death is imagined as endless unconsciousness. The self recoils from this image because it imagines itself trapped in absence. But sleep shows that absence is not experienced from the inside. There is no inside. There is no perspective. There is no suffering. The fear belongs to the imagining self, not to the state itself. This does not mean sleep and death are the same. They are not. But sleep offers a glimpse into something the self cannot comprehend directly: existence without experience, being without knowing, function without identity. This idea feels impossible during the day because the waking mind is built around awareness, around knowing that it knows. But deep sleep is a state where knowing collapses, and yet life continues. This challenges the assumption that awareness is the foundation of being. It may be the opposite. Being may be the foundation. Awareness may be an overlay. Sleep strips away the overlay, and what remains does not need to be aware of itself to be real. This is deeply counterintuitive because we spend our lives trying to become more aware, more conscious, more present. Sleep suggests that presence is not always beneficial. Sometimes the most restorative state is the absence of presence, not dissociation, not numbness, but a complete suspension of subjectivity. You are not aware that you are resting. You're not aware that time is passing. You are not aware that healing is occurring. And that unawareness is precisely what allows it. The self often interferes with its own repair by worrying, by monitoring, by checking. Sleep removes the monitor. And when the monitor is gone, systems stabilize. This reveals something quietly profound. The self is not required for well-being. It is required for meaning. Sleep prioritizes well-being over meaning. Meaning can wait, the body cannot. This is why chronic lack of deep sleep feels so destabilizing. It is not just exhaustion. It is deprivation of the only state where the system is allowed to function without interpretation, without commentary, without identity, without the burden of being someone. When this state is missing, the self never fully dissolves, and a self that never dissolves begins to believe it must always be present, always vigilant, always aware. This belief is exhausting, and it feeds anxiety, rumination, and fear. Deep sleep breaks that belief, not through insight, through erasure. For several hours, the belief does not exist, and the system survives. This survival is not conceptual. It is felt as restoration. You wake up with a sense, not a thought, that something important happened, even though you cannot say what. This sense is one of the few reliable signals that existence does not require selfhood. It requires conditions. Sleep provides those conditions by turning the self off completely. This raises a question that is uncomfortable but unavoidable. If the deepest, most nourishing state you enter each day involves the total absence of self, what does that say about how central the self really is? Is it the core of who you are? Or is it a surface phenomenon, a useful interface that must periodically shut down so that deeper processes can operate? The answer does not need to be philosophical. Sleep answers it practically, night after night. The self disappears, not partially, completely, and the result is not loss. It is renewal, which reframes the idea of temporary death. Sleep is not rehearsal for non-existence. It is rehearsal for trust. Trust that being does not require monitoring. Trust that the system knows what to do without supervision. Trust that letting go is not annihilation. This trust is not chosen, it is enforced. You cannot will yourself into dreamless sleep. You fall into it when resistance ends, when the self finally relinquishes every claim, even the claim to awareness. And in that relinquishment, there is no experience to report, no insight to bring back, only the quiet certainty that you were held, not by a thought, not by an identity, but by something deeper than both. This certainty is fragile. It fades quickly when the self returns. Language rushes in, time reappears, agency reasserts itself. The self reconstructs the world and takes its place at the center. But something has shifted, because the self has been reminded without memory that it is not the foundation, it is a layer, and layers can rest. This reminder changes how the self relates to itself, subtly, quietly. It may cling a little less, control a little less, fear disappearance a little less, because it has disappeared completely and nothing bad happened, which brings us close to the end of this exploration. But not the end of the story, because after dreamless sleep, something else always happens. You wake up, and the self returns, but it does not return untouched. It returns changed by what it cannot remember. The next question, then, is not about what happens in sleep. It is about what happens after. How the self rebuilds itself each morning. How it steps back into identity, time, agency, and recognition. And why that return is both necessary and incomplete. Because once you have disappeared so fully, even if you do not remember it, you are never quite the same person again. And that is where the next chapter quietly begins. Waking up is not the opposite of falling asleep. It is not a clean reversal. It is a reconstruction. Every morning, the self does not simply resume where it left off. It is rebuilt. Slowly at first, clumsily, almost experimentally. You can feel this if you pay attention to the first seconds of waking. There is awareness, but no story yet. Sensation without interpretation. Light without meaning. For a brief moment, there is no urgency to be anyone. Then memory arrives, not all at once, in fragments, a name, a place, a body that feels familiar. And with memory comes orientation. This is where I am. This is who I am. The self locks into place. But notice something subtle. That moment before the lock, before the full return of identity, is often the calmest moment of the day. No anxiety, no plans, no evaluation, just presence. It lasts only seconds. Then the narrative begins. What needs to be done? What went wrong yesterday? What might happen today? The self returns not because it wants to, but because the world requires it. You must be recognizable. You must be accountable. You must act as someone continuous. The social world cannot function without identity. So, the self reassembles. But it does not reassemble perfectly. It cannot, because it was offline. It was reorganized. Memory shifted. Associations changed. Emotional weights were redistributed. The self that wakes up is similar, but not identical, to the one that fell asleep. This difference is small enough to ignore, but large enough to matter. It is why moods change overnight, why priorities shift, why something that felt unbearable yesterday feels manageable today. The self attributes these changes to rest, but rest is only part of it. What really changed is the configuration of identity. Sleep did not heal the self, it interrupted it, and interruption is powerful, because uninterrupted systems become rigid. The self, when uninterrupted, loops. It reinforces the same narratives, the same fears, the same interpretations. Sleep breaks the loop, not by challenging it, but by stopping it entirely. When the self returns, it does not remember the break, but it carries the effects. This is why waking up often feels like stepping into yourself rather than being yourself. There is a slight distance, a sense of putting something on. Your name fits again. Your concerns return. But they do not grip as tightly, at least not yet. This distance fades as the day progresses. The self gathers momentum. It accumulates reasons to care, reasons to worry, reasons to defend itself. By evening, it is fully assembled, and by night, it is exhausted, which is why sleep comes again. This cycle is not accidental. It is a balance. The self is necessary, but not continuously. It must appear and disappear, assemble and dissolve. If it stayed assembled forever, it would collapse under its own weight. If it never assembled at all, the world would be unmanageable. Sleep negotiates this rhythm. It is not a luxury, it is regulation. This reframes the idea of identity in a quiet way. You're not a fixed self who occasionally rests. You are a system that periodically generates a self. That self is useful, but it is not permanent, and it is not the foundation. This perspective can feel unsettling because we are taught to locate our worth in continuity, in consistency, in being the same person over time. Sleep contradicts this gently. It says, you can change without noticing. You can dissolve without loss. You can be rebuilt without effort. This does not mean you are unstable. It means you are adaptable. Identity is not a monument. It is a process, and sleep is part of that process. This is why mornings can feel like beginnings, even when nothing new has happened, because something did begin. The self began again, but it began lighter, less certain of its own permanence, less convinced that it must hold everything together. This lightness does not last. The world quickly demands performance, but the trace remains, a faint memory without content of having been absent, of having not existed as a self and surviving. This trace is what allows people to soften, to forgive, to reset, to try again, not because they decided to, because the self was interrupted. This interruption is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it shapes behavior. People who sleep deeply often describe feeling more patient, more flexible, less reactive, not because they learned a lesson in sleep, but because the self returned with less rigidity. The edges were smoothed, the grip loosened, which brings us to an important realization. Sleep is not just recovery from the day. It is preparation for being someone again, not the same someone, a revised one. The self that returns is always provisional, always subject to change. Sleep ensures this, and this has implications beyond rest. It changes how we think about failure, about growth, about identity itself. If the self is rebuilt daily, then no single day defines you. No single mistake fixes who you are. No single success completes you. The self is not cumulative in the way it appears. It is iterative, and iteration allows correction. This is deeply reassuring if you let it be. But the self resists this reassurance. It wants to be final, definitive. It wants to believe that what it is now is what it will remain. Sleep undermines that belief. Night after night, it reminds the system that identity is flexible, that continuity is constructed, that nothing essential is lost when the self dissolves. Which leads us to a question that sits quietly beneath all of this. If the self can dissolve and reform, if identity is provisional, if being does not depend on constant selfhood, then what are we really afraid of when we fear losing ourselves? Because sleep shows that losing the self temporarily is not harmful. It is healing. So why does the idea of losing the self permanently, or even loosening it while awake, feel so threatening? That fear does not come from the body. The body sleeps easily. It does not come from existence. Existence continues without identity. It comes from something narrower, from the belief that without a stable self, nothing would matter. That meaning would vanish, that life would be empty. Sleep challenges this belief, but only indirectly. It does not argue. It demonstrates. You lose the self, and meaning pauses. But when the self returns, meaning returns too, often clearer, which suggests that meaning does not require constant selfhood. It requires cycles, engagement and release, presence and absence. Sleep provides the absence. Waking provides the engagement. Together, they create balance. But to fully understand why the self fears disappearance so deeply, we need to look beyond sleep. We need to look at death, not as an event, but as a concept shaped entirely by the self's inability to imagine absence. Sleep is the only safe approximation we have, and it reveals something the self does not want to admit. That absence is not experienced as suffering. Suffering requires presence, which means the fear of absence is always imagined from the wrong side. That fear belongs to the self, and understanding it may change how we relate not just to sleep, but to life itself. That is where the next chapter quietly turns. The fear of death is often described as a fear of nothingness, but that description hides a mistake. Nothingness is not frightening. The idea of being present inside nothingness is, and that idea belongs entirely to the self. Death, as the self imagines it, is not absence. It is the self trapped in absence, a witness with nothing to witness, an I with no world. But sleep reveals something the self cannot grasp while awake. Absence is never experienced from the inside, because experience itself requires a self. In deep sleep, there is no experience of nothingness. There is no boredom, no isolation, no darkness stretching on forever. There is no time to stretch. There is no one to be trapped. And yet, the system continues. Which means the fear of death is not fear of what happens after the self disappears. It is fear of imagining disappearance while still being a self. The self cannot imagine its own absence without smuggling itself into the picture. It imagines watching its own disappearance. That is the terror. Sleep removes this illusion. Every night, you disappear completely, and there is no one there to be afraid. This does not solve the mystery of death. It reframes the fear of it. The fear does not belong to reality. It belongs to the imagination of continuity. The self is a continuity machine. It exists to preserve a thread through time. Death threatens that thread. So the self resists the idea with everything it has. But sleep interrupts the thread nightly. And the interruption is not experienced as loss, it is experienced as rest. This contrast matters because it shows that the fear of death is not evidence of harm. It is evidence of attachment. Attachment to continuity, attachment to identity, attachment to being someone. Sleep loosens that attachment gently. It does not eliminate it. It gives the self a taste of release without consequence. This may be why people who sleep deeply often feel less haunted by existential dread, not because they have answers, but because their system regularly experiences safe discontinuity. They are reminded, without memory, that being does not require constant selfhood. This reminder does not turn into philosophy. It becomes a felt stability, a quiet resilience. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. The self fears death not because death is suffering. It fears death because death implies irrelevance, no recognition, no audience, no story continuing. Sleep removes recognition temporarily, and nothing bad happens. You are forgotten for hours, and you return. This does not mean death is the same as sleep. It means that some of the self's fears are based on false assumptions. The assumption that absence must be experienced as pain. The assumption that not being seen is the same as not being. Sleep contradicts these assumptions every night. You are not seen. You are not recognized. You are not present as a self. And existence continues, which suggests that the self's deepest fear is not non-existence. It is the end of relevance. The end of mattering. The end of being counted. This fear makes sense in a social species. We survive through recognition, through memory, through continuity. The self is built to preserve those things, but sleep reveals a deeper layer of survival. Biological survival does not require relevance. Existence does not require memory. Being does not require meaning. Meaning is something the self creates during waking life. It is not the ground of reality. Sleep removes meaning temporarily, and the system stabilizes. This does not make life meaningless. It makes meaning optional, something that can be picked up and put down. This flexibility is essential. A system that cannot let go of meaning will suffocate under it. Sleep provides relief, which reframes the idea of death in a quiet way, not as an endless sleep, not as eternal nothingness, but as something the self cannot meaningfully imagine, because imagination requires presence, and death by definition removes the imaginer. Sleep shows this limit gently. It says, "You cannot know what it is like to not be," and that is not a problem, because there is no one there to be troubled by that not knowing. This realization does not remove grief. It does not remove loss. Those belong to the living, to the selves who remain. Sleep does not erase the pain of losing others, but it may soften the fear of losing oneself, because it shows that absence is not experienced as terror. Terror requires a witness, which leads to a subtle but important shift. Perhaps the fear of death is not something to be solved. It is something to be contextualized, seen as a feature of identity, not a truth about reality. Sleep provides that context. Night after night, you step out of the story. The story pauses, and the pause is not frightening. It is quiet, which suggests that the self's grip on continuity is not absolute. It can be loosened, not just in sleep, but in how we live, not by trying to disappear, but by remembering that disappearance is not annihilation, that rest is not loss, that letting go is not falling. Sleep teaches this lesson without words. It does not ask you to believe anything. It asks you to lie down, to stop narrating, to stop watching. And it takes the self away gently every night. This is not accidental. It is a training, not for death, but for trust. Trust that existence does not depend on constant vigilance. Trust that being is not fragile. Trust that you do not have to hold yourself together forever. This trust is not something you can cultivate directly. It emerges from repetition, from the body learning over and over that letting go is safe. Sleep is that repetition, which brings us close to the final question of this exploration. If sleep is a temporary death of the self, and that death is peaceful and nothing essential is lost, then what would it mean to live with a little less attachment to being someone, not to abandon identity, but to hold it lightly, to know that it can dissolve and return, that you are not identical with it, that beneath it, something quieter continues. That knowledge does not need to be conscious. It does not need to become a belief. It can remain as a feeling, a softness, a reduced urgency. And that softness may be the real gift of sleep, not rest for the body, but relief from the burden of being a self, which brings us to the last turn in this long night, because after everything sleep dissolves, identity, time, memory, agency, meaning, one question remains. What is it that actually rests? What is it that is carried through the night when there is no one left to be carried? That question does not ask for an answer. It opens into the final chapter, where we stop looking at what disappears in sleep and begin to notice what never leaves. After everything else dissolves, one thing quietly remains. Not as an object, not as a thought, not even as awareness. It remains without needing to be present. This is difficult to describe because language always tries to point to something, and what remains is not something you can point to. It does not appear. It does not announce itself. It does not leave a trace you can remember. And yet, it is the only reason you wake up restored. When the self disappears, when memory loosens, when time collapses, when agency dissolves, when even experience itself fades, the system does not fall into chaos. It stabilizes. This stability is not conscious. It is not intelligent in the way we usually mean. It does not make plans. It does not solve problems. It simply maintains balance. Breath continues. Rhythms hold. Processes regulate themselves. This is not you as a person. This is not you as a story. This is not even you as a mind. It is life functioning without representation. And that distinction matters because the self spends its entire existence trying to represent life, to explain it, to own it, to narrate it. Sleep removes representation, and what remains does not need to be represented to function. This is why deep sleep feels so trustworthy. Even though you're not there, you're not abandoned. Something holds the system together. Not a thought, not a decision, a deeper order. You might be tempted to call this the body, but that word is still too narrow, because what remains is not just physical. Neural rhythms coordinate, chemical balances adjust, information flows. It is an integrated system, operating without a center, no commander, no observer, just regulation. This kind of regulation is older than identity, older than language, older than story. It existed long before there were selves to worry about meaning. Sleep returns you to this layer every night, not so you can understand it, so you can rely on it. Reliance does not require awareness, it requires trust. And trust here is not a belief. It is something the body learns. The body learns that it can release control and still be held, that letting go does not lead to collapse, that absence of self does not equal danger. This learning is not intellectual, it is procedural, embedded, and it changes how the self behaves when it returns. A self that has been safely absent becomes less frantic, less desperate to justify itself, less urgent in its need to matter, because somewhere beneath thought, the system remembers that it can function without constant supervision. This is why good sleep often leads to a subtle courage, not confidence, not bravado, a quiet steadiness. You face the day knowing, without knowing why, that you do not have to hold everything together by force. Something deeper exists, and it does not require you to be present. This realization challenges the deepest habit of the self, the habit of believing that if you are not watching, something will go wrong. Sleep disproves this habit nightly. Nothing goes wrong. In fact, things go right. This does not mean the self is useless. It means the self is not the foundation. It is a layer built on top of something more stable, and layers can rest. They must rest. If they do not, they crack. Sleep prevents that cracking by allowing the self to dissolve completely. What remains does not need to be named. Naming it would pull it back into representation, into thought, into identity. It does not need a name to do its work. You feel its effects every morning, in the sense that you can begin again, not as a new person, as a regulated system. This is why sleep deprivation feels like unraveling, not just exhaustion, but loss of coherence. The self stays present too long. It overextends. And without returning to this deeper layer, nothing resets. Everything feels fragile, urgent, too much. Sleep restores proportion by removing the one thing that distorts proportion the most, the self. And this brings us close to the end of this inquiry, because once you see that something remains when the self disappears, the question changes. It is no longer, what happens to me when I sleep? It becomes, what am I really if I can disappear completely and still be held? The self answers this question with fear, because fear is its language, but sleep answers it with demonstration. You disappear, and nothing essential is lost, which suggests that what you are is not identical with what you think you are. That identity is not essence, that the self is not the deepest truth of existence. It is an interface, a useful one, but not the one that rests. The thing that rests has no name, no shape, no story, and it does not care whether you understand it. It only cares that balance is restored, which leads us to the final turn of this long night. If the self is not what rests, if the self is not what remains, if the self is not the foundation, then what is the proper place of the self in a life well lived? Not how to eliminate it, not how to transcend it, but how to live with it, knowing it is temporary, knowing it can dissolve, knowing it will return, because the goal is not to stop being someone. The goal may be to stop believing that being someone is all that you are. Sleep teaches this lesson without teaching, night after night. And the last question it leaves us with is not dramatic. It is simple. If you know, somewhere beneath thought, that you can let go and be held, what changes in the way you hold yourself during the day? That question does not need an answer. It only needs to be lived. And that living is where the final chapter quietly begins. By now, something subtle may have shifted. Not an idea you can point to, not a conclusion you can repeat, just a loosening, a sense that the self, the one that speaks, plans, worries, protects, may not need to be held as tightly as it usually is. This chapter is not about sleep anymore, not directly. It is about what sleep quietly teaches the self, and how that lesson changes the way life is carried while awake, because the self does not disappear forever. It returns every morning, and that return is not a mistake. The self has work to do. It allows you to function in a world that requires names, roles, promises, memory, and responsibility. It allows you to speak in sentences that begin with I. It allows you to say, "This matters," and mean it. Without the self, life would be unmanageable. But sleep shows that life would also be unlivable if the self never rested. So the question is not whether the self should exist. The question is how it should be held. Most suffering does not come from having a self. It comes from believing the self is all there is, from believing it must be defended at all costs, from believing its fears are absolute, from believing its urgency reflects reality. Sleep interrupts that belief. Every night, the self is forced to let go, and every morning it returns, but not with proof of its own necessity, only with evidence of its dispensability. This evidence is quiet. It does not announce itself as wisdom. It shows up as subtle changes. A problem that felt overwhelming yesterday now feels workable. A fear that felt permanent now feels temporary. A conflict that felt personal now feels distant. Nothing was solved. The self was simply interrupted. This interruption creates space, and space is where perspective lives. During the day, the self tends to shrink the world around itself. Everything becomes personal. Everything becomes immediate. Everything becomes urgent. Sleep expands the frame. It reminds the system, without words, that identity is a role, not a prison, that you can step out of it and return, that nothing essential breaks when you do. This reminder changes how tightly the self grips experience. A self that knows it can dissolve is less frantic. It still plans, still cares, still protects, but it does not panic as easily. It does not assume that every threat is existential, because somewhere beneath awareness, it remembers having not existed and surviving. This memory is not accessible. You cannot recall it, but you live from it. This is why people who are well rested often seem more grounded, not smarter, not happier, just less brittle. They bend where others break. They pause where others react, not because they are more virtuous, because their self is less exhausted. It has been allowed to disappear. This chapter is about how that disappearance can echo into waking life, not as an instruction, not as a practice, but as a shift in relationship. The self does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be contextualized. Think of the self as a tool, a powerful one. It can analyze, it can predict, it can imagine futures and rehearse outcomes. But like any tool, it is not meant to be used continuously. A tool that never rests wears down both itself and the system that relies on it. Sleep is when the tool is put down. The danger is not in picking it up again. The danger is in forgetting that it can be put down. Many people live as if the self must be active at all times, as if letting go would mean failure, as if rest were irresponsible, as if silence were dangerous. This belief is learned. It comes from environments where constant vigilance is rewarded, where identity must be defended, where being seen, productive, relevant feels necessary for survival. Sleep quietly challenges this conditioning. It says, you can stop, you can disappear, you can be irrelevant for hours, and you will still be here. This does not make you passive. It makes you resilient. Resilience is not about holding on harder. It is about knowing when to let go. Sleep trains this capacity automatically. Every night, the self practices dying safely, not dramatically, gently. And because it survives this disappearance, it returns less afraid, not fearless, less afraid. This matters more than we realize. Much of human suffering is rooted in over-identification. Over-identification with thoughts, with roles, with mistakes, with expectations. When the self believes it is identical with its contents, everything becomes heavy. Every thought feels definitive. Every emotion feels permanent. Every failure feels fatal. Sleep breaks identification by breaking continuity. It says, this thought did not survive the night. This emotion did not survive the night. This urgency did not survive the night. And neither did you, as you imagined yourself. Yet something did survive. Something quieter. Something that does not argue. Something that does not demand meaning. This survival reframes suffering, not by denying it, by contextualizing it. Suffering happens to a self. The self is temporary. This does not make suffering unreal. It makes it bounded. It gives it edges. And edges are where relief begins. You may notice this when you wake after deep sleep and remember a problem. The problem returns, but it does not arrive with the same intensity. It feels more distant, as if you are standing a few steps back. That distance is not indifference. It is perspective. Perspective comes from knowing without knowing that you can step out of the story. Sleep gives you that knowledge without making it conscious, and that is its gift. This is why advice like "don't take it personally" rarely works. The self cannot decide not to take things personally. Personalization is its function. But sleep can temporarily remove the self, and when the self returns, personalization is softer, less automatic, which suggests that many of the changes people seek through effort, calm, clarity, resilience, are not achieved by strengthening the self. They are achieved by resting it, not forever, regularly. This reframes productivity, not as continuous effort, but as cycles of engagement and release. The self engages, the self dissolves, the self returns. This rhythm is natural. Ignoring it leads to burnout. Honoring it leads to balance. Sleep enforces the rhythm when we forget, which is why chronic sleep deprivation is so corrosive. It traps the self in permanent engagement, permanent identity, permanent urgency, and a self that never rests begins to believe its fears are absolute. It loses perspective. It becomes loud, rigid, desperate. Sleep quiets the self, not by convincing it, by removing it. This removal is not a failure of control. It is a necessary function, and when you understand this, not intellectually, but experientially, something shifts. You stop trying to fix yourself so aggressively. You stop assuming that every discomfort requires intervention. You allow space. You trust that not everything needs to be held together consciously. This trust is not naive. It is grounded in nightly evidence. You disappear, and you return, again and again, which means you do not have to cling so tightly while you are here. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop believing that caring requires constant tension. The self can relax without dissolving. It can soften without disappearing, because it knows, somewhere beneath thought, that disappearance is not annihilation. It is rest. This chapter is not an argument. It is an invitation to notice something you already live. The next time you wake up and feel slightly lighter, slightly less identified with yesterday's version of yourself, recognize that this is not random. It is the effect of interruption. The self was paused, the system recalibrated, and now you are back. But not exactly the same. This is not mystical. It is biological. It is psychological. It is structural. And it points toward a way of living that is less harsh, less self-centered, less afraid. Not because you transcend the self, because you stop believing it must be awake all the time. Sleep teaches this lesson slowly, night after night, without words, without insight, just by happening. Which brings us to the final chapter, not a conclusion, not a summary. A settling, because after everything we have explored, identity, time, memory, agency, fear, absence, there is only one thing left to do: to lie down, to let go, to allow the self to do what it has always done at the end of the day: disappear, not as an ending, as a kindness. And that kindness is where the final chapter begins. Night does not arrive as a command. It arrives as permission. Permission to stop holding the shape of yourself together. All day the self works to remain intact. It keeps edges sharp. It maintains continuity. It insists on coherence. It does this not because it enjoys the effort, but because effort is how it stays visible. Sleep asks nothing of this visibility. It does not ask you to understand. It does not ask you to improve. It does not ask you to let go deliberately. It simply waits, And when the self finally grows tired of maintaining itself, night receives it without judgment. This is not surrender as defeat. It is surrender as relief. The self has done its job for the day. It has protected you. It has navigated the world. It has spoken, decided, remembered, worried. Now it is allowed to step aside, not forever, just long enough. There is a gentleness to this arrangement that we rarely notice. The self is not punished for existing. It is not erased because it is wrong. It is rested because it is finite. Finite systems need interruption. Without interruption, they collapse. Sleep is the interruption that keeps the self from believing it must be everything. This chapter does not end with an answer. Because sleep does not answer questions, it dissolves them. Questions require a questioner, and the questioner does not survive the night. What survives is quieter, not wiser in words, not clearer in meaning, just balanced. The body settles into rhythms older than thought. Breath moves without instruction. Cells repair without recognition. No one is there to witness this. And that is why it works. Witnessing is a kind of pressure. It introduces expectation. Sleep removes expectation entirely, which is why the deepest rest feels so complete. Nothing is being asked of you, not even to be. In the darkness of dreamless sleep, there is no you to lose, no self to protect, no identity to maintain, and yet something unmistakably continues, not as a person, as life. This continuation does not announce itself. It does not feel important. It does not demand attention. It simply carries you, hour after hour, without reference to who you are. This is the part that the self never remembers, but always benefits from. It wakes up restored without knowing why. And because it does not know why, it often takes credit. I feel better. I needed that. But the self did not do the work. It was absent. This absence is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. A design that recognizes the limits of identity. A design that ensures no one has to be present all the time. Night after night, this design repeats itself. Not dramatically, not symbolically. Practically, you lie down. The self loosens. Thoughts slow. Narration fades. Ownership dissolves, and eventually, even awareness releases its grip. There is no marker for this moment, no threshold you cross knowingly. You do not notice when you stop being someone. You simply are not there anymore, and nothing bad happens. This fact is so ordinary that we overlook how radical it is. You disappear completely, and the world inside you remains gentle. This gentleness is not emotional. It is structural, a system that does not require a witness to function, a system that does not need meaning to regulate itself, a system that does not collapse when identity steps aside. Every night, you are entrusted to that system, not because you chose it, because it is there. This is not meant to change how you think. It is meant to soften how tightly you hold yourself. Tomorrow, the self will return. It will pick up its name, its concerns, its plans. It will step back into the role it knows so well, and that is fine. The world needs someone, but perhaps it does not need someone who believes they must be someone at all costs. Perhaps it is enough to be someone who knows, quietly, that being someone is not the whole story, that beneath the effort of identity, beneath the urgency of meaning, beneath the fear of disappearance, there is something steady that does not require your attention, something that holds you when you're gone. This knowing does not need to be conscious. It does not need to become a belief. It can remain as a feeling, a reduced urgency, a softer grip, a willingness to rest. Tonight, when sleep arrives, you do not need to do anything differently. You do not need to remember this. You do not need to let go on purpose. Sleep will take care of that for you. It always has, and somewhere between the last thought you finish and the first moment you never remember, the self will step aside once more, not as a loss, not as an ending, but as the quiet kindness that makes tomorrow possible.